You might be sitting in a dimly lit room right now, or perhaps you are watching the world quietly pass by a window.
Right.
Wherever you are, just let the noise of the day fade away. Breathe in the stillness.
It is important to find that quiet space.
It really is, because in this quiet space, we are going to look at the invisible architecture of your daily life.
Yeah.
We are opening a profoundly thoughtful book together, Alfred North Whitehead's Modes of Thought.
It's a beautiful text.
It is, and this isn't just a text to be read, it's an invitation. It gently asks you to freely examine the ultimate undefinable notions that shape every single thing you do, even if you rarely pause to actually notice them.
It is a remarkable invitation. And what is truly fascinating here is Whitehead's opening premise. He suggests that philosophical truth is not actually found in express statements.
Right, which goes against how we usually think about it.
Exactly. It's not about rigid, loud declarations or perfectly neat formulas. Instead, truth is meant to be sought in the presuppositions of language.
The things we don't say.
Yes. It hides in the quiet shadows of the words we use every single day, in the things we leave entirely unsaid because they're so deeply embedded in our fundamental understanding of reality.
Wait, I want to pause right there because that feels a bit counterintuitive.
I thought that.
Well, he essentially says that philosophy is akin to poetry, and I am struggling with that a bit. Usually you think of philosophy as strict, dry mathematical logic,
Right.
and poetry as pure, unbound, messy emotion. How can they possibly be aiming at the same thing?
It is a brilliant paradox. Both the poet and the philosopher are ultimately attempting to capture the vast, often unspeakable undercurrents of human experience.
Oh, I see.
They are reaching for a profound generality. Think about how difficult it is to describe a highly complex emotion to a friend.
Words always fail you.
Always. Philosophy and poetry both seek to express that ultimate good sense which we call civilization. But the human mind really struggles with this vastness.
Because it's too much to process.
Exactly. Because the unspeakable is so overwhelming, we tend to build systems. We like to organize our thoughts into neat, finite boxes to make the universe feel manageable.
And Whitehead warns us against jumping straight into those boxes, doesn't he?
He does, very strongly.
This feels incredibly relevant to how we live today. I mean, we are entirely obsessed with building perfect systems.
Oh, absolutely.
Optimizing our morning routines, life hacking our productivity, categorizing our diets.
Everything has to be a system.
Right. But if we jump straight into building a system, we miss the actual messy, beautiful reality of the morning itself.
Because we are too busy trying to optimize it.
Exactly. And Whitehead says that building a system of philosophy often leads to pedantry.
That's the exact word, pedantry.
Yeah.
In all systematic thought, there's a tinge of this pedantry. It is a deliberate putting aside of messy, real-world experiences and vague notions.
Just ignoring the chaos.
Yes, with a rather prim excuse that we are not currently thinking of such things. We forcefully ignore the vague background just to make our specific foreground look clean.
So, before we can safely categorize or systematize anything, there's a necessary previous task.
Assemblage.
Right, assemblage. He calls it the entertaining of notions of large, adequate generality. It is keeping your mind entirely open.
Gathering the wildly varied thoughts that throng into our experience before trying to force them into any kind of rigid structure.
You can actually trace this struggle between messy reality and neat systems through the history of human thought, can't you?
You really can. Whitehead breaks down 4 great thinkers of Western literature whose services to civilized thought rest largely upon their incredible achievements in this philosophical assemblage.
Let's softly tread through them. First, we have Plato.
Yes, Plato. He certainly grasped the importance of mathematical systems, but his chief fame really rests on the sheer wealth of profound suggestions scattered throughout his dialogues.
Like a massive chaotic brainstorm on a whiteboard.
Exactly. His ideas were brilliant, even if they were partly smothered by the archaic misconceptions of the ancient world he lived in.
But then Aristotle comes along and looks at Plato's messy whiteboard.
And Aristotle systematized as he assembled.
He inherited all of Plato's flowing, vague ideas and essentially said, let's clean this up.
He imposed his own highly rigid, logical structures upon them.
And following Aristotle, we look centuries later at Leibniz.
Here's a man of profound learning who essentially synthesized 2,000 years of thought.
His interests were staggering.
Staggering. He worked across mathematics, divinity, political philosophy, and physical science. As Whitehead points out, there is an entire book waiting to be written simply titled The Mind of Leibniz.
Because he inherited more varied thoughts from his predecessors than perhaps any thinker before or since.
He acted as the ultimate assembler.
And finally, there is William James.
The essentially modern man.
Right. His greatness didn't just lie in his understanding of the past, but in his marvelous, acute sensitivity to the present moment.
He traveled, he built personal relations, he studied a vast variety of topics.
But here's where it gets deeply interesting to me. James's entire intellectual life was a rebellion against dismissing lived experience just to serve the interests of a neat system.
He intuitively understood that we cannot throw away the raw emotion and messiness of human life just to make our philosophical theories look mathematically clean.
Which brings us back to that word Whitehead used earlier when comparing philosophy and poetry: civilization.
Yes. To understand what civilization actually is, Whitehead uses a truly beautiful comparison.
The birds.
The birds. Consider the hermit thrush and the nightingale. They produce sounds of the utmost beauty in the forest.
Gorgeous sounds.
Furthermore, higher animals exhibit deep love, devotion, and a beauty of performance that rightly claims our tenderness in return. Yet despite all this beauty and emotion, these animals are not civilized.
Let me see if I have this right. The bird singing beautifully is basically stuck inside a maze. It is just reacting to the immediate walls around it, reacting to the moment. Civilization is the ability to float above the maze, to look at the whole picture and understand how your actions fit into the grand scheme of things.
Whitehead says they lack ideas of adequate generality regarding their own actions.
So to be civilized, you must survey the world with a large generality of understanding. It isn't just about feeling, it is about holding a broad, comprehending view of your own existence.
That is a perfect way to visualize it. And floating above that maze raises an important question about how we actually experience that existence.
How so?
Well, Whitehead argues that there are two contrasted, antithetical ideas that inevitably underlie all our width of experience. The first is matter of fact, and the second is importance.
Let's look at matter of fact first.
This is the inescapable, sheer, mere existence of things. It is the inescapable recognition of the physical goings-on of nature in which we are entirely immersed.
But wait, if matter of fact is just the inescapable existence of things, doesn't that make life feel incredibly robotic?
It can feel that way.
It feels tinged with a sort of compulsive determinism, like we are just completely trapped by the physical laws of the universe.
We are, in a sense, bound by those necessities. Think of the historical anecdote Whitehead brings up about an educated Roman during the ancient empire.
The midnight sun.
Yes. This Roman entirely refused to believe the report of the midnight sun in the far north.
Because it broke his rules.
Exactly. Because to his educated mind, the rotating earth and the routine of day and night were prime necessities of life. A sun that didn't set simply violated his firm, matter-of-fact grasp of nature's inescapable necessities.
There is no escape from sheer matter of fact. It is the physical basis of everything.
But the sheer volume of that matter-of-fact world is overwhelming every leaf, every grain of sand, every passing second.
This must be where the second idea enters the picture: importance.
Yes, because the universe is an infinite multiplicity of matter-of-fact, our finite human intellect is forced to select.
We literally cannot process everything.
We must choose to attend to this rather than that.
It makes me think of the modern attention economy.
Oh, that's a great connection.
We are bombarded with infinite data, and if we don't aggressively filter what is important to us, our brains would just short circuit.
Exactly. Importance is the reason we concentrate, and that necessary selection requires a sense of relative importance.
Without feeling that one thing is more important than another, you wouldn't be able to focus on anything at all.
From this very act of selection, intellectual freedom is born. So importance, selection, and intellectual freedom are completely bound up together.
It is a highly delicate balance to strike. Human consciousness fuses that large generality of feeling with an insistent particularity.
When we are fully engaged in civilized experience, our characteristic thoughts are things like, this is important, or that is difficult, or this is lovely.
We use the insistent pinpoint particularity of this or that, combined with a large, somewhat vague characterization of emotional excitement.
But our everyday language constantly struggles to express this fusion accurately.
Language fails us constantly in this regard.
There is a wonderful anecdote about the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge that beautifully illustrates this exact failure of language.
I love this story.
Coleridge was standing before an awe-inspiring, majestic waterfall, a massive, roaring torrent of sheer natural power.
It's just breathtaking.
And he overheard a tourist standing nearby, gazing at this profound spectacle. And the tourist just blurted out,
How pretty.
"Yes, how pretty."
No, that hurts to even hear. How pretty. It is such a degenerate, tiny phrase.
He completely lets down the whole vividness of the scene.
It is like looking at the Grand Canyon and saying, well, that's a nice hole.
It is a jarring mismatch, isn't it?
It
It perfectly illustrates how words, which are practically designed to indicate useful particularities, so often fail to evoke the profound general character of importance.
The word pretty is a useful particularity for a teacup or a flower, but it fails the vastness of the waterfall.
It is one of the essential functions of great literature to evoke a vivid feeling of what lies beyond those heavily inadequate words.
So how do we fix this? How do we grasp these massive concepts and feel what lies beyond the words?
Whitehead advises something that sounds completely backwards. He quietly suggests that in order to acquire true learning, we must first shake ourselves free of it.
We have to unlearn.
We must grasp a topic in the rough, in its messy assemblage, before we try to smooth it out and shape it into a system.
He offers a rather sharp critique of the philosopher John Stuart Mill on this exact point, doesn't he?
He does. Mill had a highly peculiar, heavily managed education. He was handed rigid systems of thought by his father long before he ever had the chance to enjoy the relevant, messy, unstructured experiences of life.
Because of this, his mental systems were closed off from the vague beyond.
The lesson here is that while we must eventually be systematic to function, we should always keep our systems completely open and remain highly sensitive to their limitations.
But keeping our systems open is incredibly hard because we carry so much historical baggage that restricts us.
We barely realize it.
The general notions that underlie modern Western thought are largely inherited from the ancient world. The Greeks gave us aesthetic and logical enjoyment.
The Semites gave us moral and religious worship.
The Egyptians gave us practical observation. We are viewing the world through lenses crafted thousands of years ago.
And while those cultural inheritances are absolutely foundational, they have also tightly restricted our notion of importance to those specific ancient forms. We fall into a trap.
Whitehead gently advises that we must mentally disengage from these specific mentalities, shake ourselves free of them to truly grasp the broader notion of importance and matter of fact.
If we don't unlearn this baggage, we fall victim to what is called the myth of isolation.
Let's softly tread into that myth, because this changes how you view everything around you. The idea of a single fact in isolation is a complete fabrication.
It is a myth created by our abstractive intellect, which is simply unable to embrace the infinite totality of the universe at once.
Think about how a baby experiences the world. If a baby plays with a ball, they don't look at it and think of an isolated geometric sphere.
Not at all.
They are fully immersed in the feeling of play, the warmth of the room, the presence of their parent. For them, and in true reality, everything is intimately connected.
Connectedness is of the absolute essence of all things. No fact is merely itself. Whenever we consider a single fact, there is a suppressed presupposition of the entire environment required for that fact to even exist.
The environment is the whole universe in its perspective to that single fact.
And this brings us to the formal definition of perspective. Because the universe has infinite details that produce infinite effects, there must be some agent that grades the relevance of all these countless details. That agent is feeling.
So feeling grades the universe based on our specific interest. Perspective, then, is the dead abstraction of mere fact, pulled from the living, breathing importance of things felt.
It is just the tool our finite intellect uses to deal with the myth of finite facts.
Which is an entirely valid procedure for navigating daily life, provided we remember what we are doing.
The immense danger arises when we forget that our logic and our science are operating within an environment they cannot fully define.
If you develop any logical argument long enough, sooner or later, it is bound to arrive at a contradiction.
Either internally or externally, in its reference to the wider physical fact.
The lifespans of our scientific truths really put this into a humbling perspective. Whitehead points out that it took logic roughly 3,000 to 4,000 years of continuous thought to finally uncover its latent contradictions.
Unguarded Newtonian physics survived for about 300 years before its profound limitations were exposed by relativity and quantum mechanics.
And modern scientific schemes, they have a lifespan of about 30 years before they hit a wall and need to be drastically revised.
That accelerating decay of absolute certainty is striking. But we must be very careful with how we frame this.
Right.
These scientific myths and earlier systems are not strictly wrong in an absolute, unqualified sense. They are simply unguarded.
Their truth is limited by unexpressed presuppositions.
As time passes and our perspective shifts, we merely discover those limitations. The simple-minded, binary use of the notions right and wrong is actually one of the chief obstacles to the true progress of understanding.
That binary thinking, right versus wrong, also heavily obscures how we view the concept of importance. We constantly reduce importance to just a few dominant species.
People will passionately claim that morality or logic or religion or art exhausts the whole meaning of importance in life.
But they are merely species of it.
There are vast perspectives of the universe to which morality is totally irrelevant, or to which logic is irrelevant.
To beautifully illustrate the irrelevance of moral considerations in certain specific contexts, Whitehead shares a quiet, highly revealing anecdote.
A 10-year-old girl is taken to an afternoon performance of the opera Carmen,
She sits in the theater watching the smugglers on stage.
taking in their carefree, technically criminal behavior, the passionate dancing, the glorious singing.
As they leave the theater, she looks up at her aunt and earnestly asks, "Were those really good people?"
And the adults, of course, probably just shuffle their feet, look for their car, and sidestep the question.
But the philosophical point underneath that child's question is brilliant. The moral codes of society are entirely irrelevant to the aesthetic enjoyment of the theatrical stage.
While the characters are singing and dancing, morals vanish, and aesthetic beauty takes supreme command.
It shows that moral codes only apply to the systematic character of a relevant universe.
When the presuppositions of that universe don't apply, like inside an opera house, the moral code becomes a vacuous, empty statement.
It completely shatters the illusion of absolute, unqualified stability of particular moral codes.
Let us look at the natural world. Imagine trying to apply human family moral notions to a species of fish that produces hundreds of thousands of eggs in a single year.
It is biologically nonsensical.
It is.
Trying to apply human family values to a fish with 100,000 kids is absurd. The parent-teacher conferences alone would be a nightmare.
The human moral framework just physically does not fit the reality of that existence.
Precisely. We are simply examining how we view these moral absolutes from a philosophical distance.
Take the Ten Commandments, for instance. Whitehead calmly asks you to consider the nature of these laws.
Is resting on the seventh day, as distinct from the sixth or eighth day, an absolute universal law of all existence throughout the cosmos?
Or is it a highly practical, incredibly useful guideline designed for ordinary human circumstances? Is the division of time into days an absolute factor in the nature of all reality?
Evidently, they are meant to be construed with common sense. There is no one singular behavior system belonging to the essential character of the entire universe.
What is truly universal is the spirit that should permeate the behavior. True morality, as defined in this exploration, consists in the control of process so as to maximize importance.
It is the aim at greatness of experience.
And this brings us to a stark conclusion. Whether you are casually swatting an insect, cutting down a towering tree, executing a criminal, or destroying a monument like the Parthenon.
An action is moral or immoral only based on whether that specific action safeguards the ultimate importance of experience, so far as it depends on that concrete instance in the world's history.
Morality is fundamentally the union of harmony, intensity, and vividness.
So as we aim for that greatness of experience, we have to acknowledge something incredibly strange about human progress. Great advances in human thought are very often the result of fortunate errors.
Oversimplification, even when technically wrong, can be a massively powerful tool.
I keep thinking about Aristotle and Plato in this context.
They provide the perfect contrast for this idea. Aristotle gave the Western world the strict classification of genus, species, and subspecies.
It was a happy, neat idea that clarified scientific and philosophical thinking for 2,000 years. It allowed us to organize the world.
But technically, if you push beyond the presuppositions, Aristotle was completely wrong.
Nature has no perfectly clear divisions anywhere. Everything bleeds into everything else.
Plato, on the other hand, intuitively felt that divisions were hazy and vague. He was messy, he was muddled, but technically, he was far more correct about the fluid nature of reality.
Yet, Plato's muddled correctness didn't advance scientific thought the way Aristotle's wildly useful error did.
Aristotle's oversimplification, his fortunate error, fueled centuries of intellectual progress simply because it was practically relevant to the simplified notions of the time.
It proves that all classification ultimately depends on the current character of what a specific age deems important. And we see this clearly when we look through the wide lens of history.
The ancient Greeks, for instance, were largely ignorant of history beyond a few contemporaneous generations. They focus on the present aesthetic and logic.
The Jewish people, on the other hand, worshipped their long historical records uncritically, placing immense importance on the continuum of time.
And the Egyptians.
They were so relentlessly practical, so focused on the immediate engineering of their world, that they would have heavily criticized the very concept of history had they not been so entirely absorbed in the matter-of-fact observations of their daily physical lives.
It is fascinating to see how the very structure of what we consider knowledge and what we consider true shifts entirely depending on the cultural weight of importance.
Which perfectly sets the stage as we turn the page and follow Whitehead's line of thought directly into the very next phase of his argument. And as that realization kind of settles into our minds, we find ourselves just seamlessly transitioning into the next phase of the book, moving deeper into these meditations by Alfred North Whitehead. If we just take a moment to look back at the overarching premise we are exploring here, you see a philosophy that fundamentally challenges how we humans perceive our own reality.
Right, it shifts our gaze.
Exactly. It shifts it away from the cold, isolated facts of the world and redirects it toward the underlying values, the unseen threads, the vital connections that actually shape our existence.
It is a very quiet but profound revolution in thought.
It is. And it's this overarching tension, this battle between cold, hard data and the breathing, messy reality of life that really anchors everything we're about to discuss now. We are going to quietly unravel the book's critique of modern historical and scientific thought, and then trace its graceful transition into these fascinating theories on human expression and the very boundaries of the physical body.
Which is a beautiful journey to take.
It really is. And I invite you to just lean into this calm, reflective exploration with us. It all begins with a look at the evolution of historical criticism. The book draws a rather striking, almost humorous contrast between the ancient Egyptians and the Greeks.
Yes, the Egyptians. The book notes that they possessed they had too much common sense.
Too much common sense.
They were entirely practical. And because of this relentless practicality, they completely failed to generalize their vast geometrical knowledge. By clinging solely to what was tangible and immediately useful, they essentially lost the chance to become the true founders of modern civilization.
Which is such a wild thought.
It is.
Yeah.
The Greeks, on the other hand, with what the book affectionately calls their airy generalizations, acted much like children. Playful, yes. Unrestrained by immediate practicality. But this childishness, this willingness to play with abstract thought and let their minds wander beyond mere utility, that was immensely fortunate for the modern world. It is a beautiful paradox to consider. The book captures this sentiment perfectly with a thought that really deserves to be pondered quietly.
What was the quote again?
Panic of error is the death of progress, and love of truth is its safeguard.
Panic of error is the death of progress. That fear of making a mistake is the very thing that keeps you from discovering the truth.
Exactly.
It's fascinating to see how that tension plays out in the way the modern world has approached the criticism of history over the last 4 centuries. The book walks us through an evolution of this historical study, outlining 3 distinct phases.
The first phase was purely about authenticity. Picture meticulous, quiet scholars in dusty rooms asking binary, definitive questions. Did Plato actually write this specific dialogue? Did Emperor Constantine truly make that donation?
So it was a pursuit of the absolute origin.
Yes. From there, this correction passed into a second phase, focusing heavily on emendation, on the granular details of the texts themselves.
Right, so scholars would ask if a specific manuscript of the Aeneid was the exact word-for-word version that Virgil wrote. But the book takes a wonderfully winding path here to point out the vagueness inherent in this quest. It uses Homer and the Iliad as an example.
I love this tangent in the text.
It's brilliant. We are reminded that papyrus was a scarce and precious resource back then. Bards relied entirely on memory, passing the poem down through generations with what the author calls a sublime indifference to minor variations.
A sublime indifference. The idea of an entirely accurate, static, unchanging record is, in many ways, just a modern illusion born of the printing press.
That naturally brings us to the third phase of historical criticism, which the book describes as the study of transitions of behavior.
This is the moment historians stopped merely correcting the grammar of ancient texts and began depicting types of activities, shifting moods, and the formulation of human beliefs.
You can clearly see this shift by contrasting two figures mentioned in the book. There is Richard Bentley, the typical scholar who focused heavily on correcting ancient texts. And then there's Edward Gibbon, who stepped back and looked at the wider picture, tracing the sweeping decline of an entire political system and the very human motives behind it.
But where the book becomes truly provocative, I think, is in its critique of the most recent trend in historical study.
The influence of physical science.
Precisely. Under that heavy influence, history has increasingly been reduced to the narration of mere sequences, leaning heavily on matter-of-fact economics. The book is quite clear on why this is a profound flaw. You simply cannot write a genuine history of something like the papacy without intimately understanding the sheer motive power of religious belief.
Right, because just knowing the economic transactions of the Vatican doesn't explain the Crusades.
Not at all. That religious belief is not just a footnote. It is a mode of causation derived directly from a mode of thought. When history is reduced to a mere sequence of physical behaviors or economic data points, it becomes a make-believe. It ignores the actual human motives that drive those sequences.
The author suggests that what we call matter of fact is actually an abstraction.
Yes.
It is a conceptual net we cast over the world, but the actual concrete reality of life just slips right through those meshes.
This is why science, when it reaches a certain level of perfection, tends to relapse into the study of differential equations. It abstracts the world until the pulsing reality of human existence vanishes completely.
The book offers a brilliantly absurd example to highlight this. Imagine trying to understand the incredible turmoil of Europe by simply weighing its dictators, its prime ministers, and its newspaper editors on a scale.
Or taking their bodily temperatures every single day.
Yes. Picture a researcher meticulously recording that a particular dictator gained 2 pounds and had a slight fever on a Tuesday.
You might gather a mountain of data that way. But the information is utterly, laughably incomplete when it comes to understanding why nations are actually going to war. Knowing someone's temperature does not tell you if they are furious enough to start a revolution.
And the same applies to looking back at broader history. The book argues that you cannot look at the 16th century and see only religious excitement. To study the turmoil of the Reformation without simultaneously looking at the discovery of America, the trade with India, the rise of the Turks, the swelling of nationalism, and the diffusion of the printing press, it's ridiculous.
All these factors intricately interweave with the religious interest. We cannot escape the aesthetic, religious, and moral notions of humanity. They are the energizing, disrupting forces of civilization.
Whitehead isn't just giving us a history lesson here, is he?
No. He is diagnosing a modern condition. When a society tries to put these messy human forces aside in favor of the stable, cold generalities of science, the book warns of a slow, mild decay. It uses a haunting phrase for this phenomenon. The concentration on mere matter of fact results in the supremacy of the desert.
The supremacy of the desert. A barren landscape where the rich, complex connections of human experience have simply dried away, leaving only isolated grains of sand.
It's a sobering image.
With that image in mind, the book transitions into its second major section. It shifts our focus gently from the concept of importance to the concept of expression.
To really understand this transition, we need to look at the philosophical distinction the book draws between the two. Importance is described as monistic.
Monistic.
Yes. Think of it as relating to the universe as a whole. It is the infinite, immanent in the finite. It passes from the world as one down to the world as many.
And
Expression, however, is pluralistic. It originates entirely within the finite occasion. It is the messy, varied way we push back out into that universe. It is the activity of a finite entity impressing itself upon its surrounding environment. It is the gift from the world as many back to the world as one.
So if importance is the gift of the whole to the part, expression is the gift from the part back to the whole. And expression requires selection. It requires individuality. A specific mood of a finite thing reaches out and conditions its environment. This is in stark contrast to the laws of nature, which the book describes as large average effects that reign impersonally over everything.
There's absolutely nothing average about expression, which leads the book to question where the source of this expression truly lies. And this brings us to an incredibly profound thought experiment about the boundaries of the physical body.
This is one of my favorite parts of the text. I just love the quiet wonder of it.
It is remarkable.
The book asks us to consider a single definite molecule. Imagine this molecule has been traveling for millions of years. Perhaps it began its journey in the swirling gases of a distant nebula. Over eons, it finds its way to Earth, it enters the soil, becomes part of a vegetable, someone eats that vegetable, or perhaps the molecule simply passes into the air and is breathed into human lungs.
The question the book poses is this. At what exact millisecond does that ancient molecule cease to be part of the external world and suddenly become part of you? And when it is eventually exhaled or discarded, at what exact moment does it stop being you?
The realization is that exactness here is entirely impossible.
Exactly. To draw a hard, definitive line is merely a trivial convention we use for convenience. The boundary between us and the universe is porous.
Which brings the author to a redefining first definition of the body. He writes, "The human body is that region of the world which is the primary field of human expression."
Think about how an internal feeling, like anger, originates. It issues into an excitement of that specific bodily region and then publicizes itself outward into the environment through the form of language or violent action.
Which elegantly refutes extreme behaviorism. If we are merely biological machines reacting to stimuli, the concept of internal expression loses all meaning.
The book makes a rather dry, amusing observation about this. It notes that a consistent behaviorist cannot actually feel that it is important to refute these philosophical statements. A true behaviorist can only behave.
I love that dry wit. But the book doesn't stop with humans. It expands this definition of the body to include all living things, bringing plants and animals into the fold of expression.
A region is alive wherever it is, the primary field of the expressions issuing from each of its parts. And here the book draws a brilliant comparison between flora and fauna. It describes vegetables, plants, as democracies.
Democracies of vegetables.
Yes, because they lack a single dominant center of experience. If you take a plant and subdivide it, taking a cutting from its branches or its roots, those minor democracies can easily survive on their own. The expressions within a plant are decentralized.
And animals.
Animals, conversely, are described as feudal societies. An animal possesses one central experience, an overlord, that expresses itself throughout the entirety of the body. But it is a complex society, because the body is also made up of specialist subordinate centers that impose their own expressions on each other.
The book uses the analogy of the heart versus the foot to explain this feudal system. A foot can be severed. It is a trauma, certainly, but the whole organism can survive with slight damage to its overall internal functioning. The heart, however, is an essential subordinate governor. Without it, the entire feudal society collapses.
But there is a vital limitation to this animal overlord. It faces novel situations by relying on conventional devices. An intelligent dog can be trained to learn new behaviors, but its heart must simply continue its rhythmic beating within very close conventional limits. A dog is bound by its biology. It cannot conceptualize a completely different mode of existence.
And that feels like the exact boundary line the book draws when we get to humanity. The text describes it as crossing the Rubicon. What defines humanity in this framework is our unique capacity for the conceptual entertainment of unrealized possibility.
Imagination.
Yes.
The profound sense of what might be. We introduce what the author calls outrageous novelty into the world. It is the emergence of ideals. We see this in morality, which focuses on the detailed occasion, striving for the best in the specific moment, and we see it in religion, which focuses on the unity of the ideal inherent in the entire universe.
To give this all context, the book summarizes 4 distinct grades of existence in nature.
Let's walk through them because they build upon each other beautifully. The first is the non-living or inorganic grade. This is entirely dominated by the average, by formal relations like gravity. A stone does not express individuality. It merely conforms to physical laws.
Right, it just exists within the averages.
The second is the vegetable grade. This adds organic individuality to that average formality. It is a democracy of purposeful influences aiming at survival. A tree is reacting to its environment, seeking sunlight, expressing a localized purpose that a stone does not possess.
And then we move to the third grade, the animal.
Which introduces a central actuality. It has a complex coordination of bodily functions and purposes that faintly transcend mere survival. An animal plays, it feels affection, it establishes a feudal hierarchy within its own body and its pack.
And finally, the fourth grade, the human.
An immense extension of the concept of importance, defined by the introduction of that outrageous novelty we just discussed, along with morals and religion.
But even as we reach this peak of existence, the book cautions us about the trap of our own superficial senses. It contrasts 2 physical reactions to illustrate this. Think of a rock falling to the ground. That is impartial gravitation governed by formal relations. Now contrast that with an angry man knocking his neighbor down.
That action is driven by individual satisfaction, by the selectiveness of enjoyment and emotion. The critique the book levels at human consciousness here is striking. We walk through the world mistakenly believing that our conscious minds are observing fundamental nature.
When in reality,
In reality, we are only observing the most superficial, changeable aspects of our relation to the world, things like eyesight and hearing. The truly fundamental operations, our complex viscera, our digestion, the circulation of our blood, we take entirely for granted unless we fall ill.
we think our eyes are showing us the truth of the universe, but they are just skimming the surface. The book makes the profound point that those who are blind or deaf are entirely capable of experiencing the ultimate greatness of human life. Sight and hearing, as highly prized as they are merely walking sticks for the human soul.
Which leads to the traffic light analogy. This perfectly encapsulates this trap. The author argues that trying to explain ultimate reality solely through our sense impressions is like trying to explain the entire sociology of modern civilization as being wholly derivative of traffic signals.
The traffic signals condition and manage the flow of the cars. You stop at red, you go at green. But the signals are not the reason for the traffic. They don't explain why the driver is going to work or driving to see a loved one.
Exactly. In the same way, our sense experiences are merely manageable grips we've evolved to navigate the world. They are the traffic lights, but they are not the deep, underlying vagueness of real existence. The philosophical pitfall is concentrating so intently on these manageable relationships that we neglect the intimate organic necessities of nature that actually drive us.
We get obsessed with the red and green lights and completely forget about the people inside the cars. But as we seek a manageable connection to this deep, underlying reality, we arrive at the ultimate triumph of human ingenuity. We arrive at language.
Language.
Language is framed as the most exquisite tool we have fabricated to express our internal reality.
The book explores a fascinating evolutionary question here.
Hmm?
Why did sound win out over sight? Why didn't we develop a language primarily of gesticulation, of hand movements? The answer provided is beautifully grounded in our physical nature. Gesticulation ties up the hands, and the hands, relatively speaking, are unnecessary for our most intimate bodily existence. We can survive without them.
But voice production requires the lungs and the throat. It requires the breath. By using the respiratory system to speak, we are actively exciting the deep, vague intimacies of our organic life.
That physical resonance is why voice-produced sound carries what the book calls a sense of reality. It is why a personal interview, sitting across from a breathing human being, holds so much more weight than simply listening to a recording. The book offers a historical joke to make this point. If gramophones and records were truly enough to convey the reality of knowledge, then the 16th century universities could have simply been replaced by 50 gramophones. But instead, that era saw a massive boom in the foundation of actual physical educational institutions. The presence of the organic body is required to sustain the sense of reality.
And this language, born from our deep organic center, serves two distinct functions. The first, which we often overlook, is to converse with oneself. It is articulated memory. It is an expression from your past self handed to your present self, giving distinctness to your memories.
And the second function.
The second is to converse with another. When we speak, we are using words to recombine the fragmentary past experiences of the listener, guiding them into a completely novel, imaginative experience.
The author concludes this thought by referencing Descartes' concept of realitas objectiva. To break that down simply, Descartes is arguing that our words aren't just painting pretty abstract pictures in our heads. Sentences point away from abstractions and high-grade sensory data.
So when you picture that earlier example of the angry man knocking his neighbor down,
The core of your thought is not a swirling flux of imagined visual colors and shapes. The true core of the thought is the concrete relations of real events happening between real entities. Language is the bridge that connects the physical breath to the abstract ideal, grounding our outrageous novelty in the reality of our biological existence.
it is a profound realization. If our language is indeed that deeply tied to our internal organic reality, if every single spoken word is a literal echo of our physical lungs and throat vibrating, connecting us to the abstract realm of human ideals,
Then what happens when we begin to outsource our language to machines that possess no organic body at all?
when the physical body and the philosophical mind are so tightly woven together, separating them might just unravel our very definition of expression, leaving us to wonder what remains when the breath is.
And that actually brings us perfectly into the very subtle, almost hidden mechanics of how importance and expression manifest in the quietest moments of our lives. Because if you really look at this book by Alfred Whitehead, it's not just a dense collection of philosophical thoughts.
No, not at all.
It's this profound, incredibly demanding framework that explores the exact mechanics of human thought, and by extension, your entire connection to the universe.
It really is.
It forces you to just completely slow down and reconsider the entire architecture of your own mind.
Right.
It asks you to figure out why you actually think the way you do.
Right, because it demands a fundamental shift in how you perceive the very fabric of reality itself.
Yeah.
Whitehead forces you to look incredibly closely at the physical reality of events versus how you actually express them. And what's deeply fascinating here is how meticulously he strips away your everyday assumptions.
Your assumptions about what you're observing in any given moment.
See, exactly. He asks you to separate the raw, unified truth of an event from the fragmented sensory data your brain uses to construct it.
I want to break that down a bit because he uses this incredibly visceral, almost jarring example of an angry man knocking someone down.
Right, the physical altercation.
Yeah. If you just look at the surface of that event, your brain immediately breaks it down into pieces.
Yeah.
You see the swinging arm, you hear the impact, you see the falling body. But Whitehead is essentially saying that this fragmentation is basically a lie our brains tell us.
Yes. I mean, an observer standing on the street might simply say they're witnessing a flux of visual sensa.
Which is just a very philosophical way of saying.
A series of shapes and colors and movements shifting in space.
Right.
Or consider a scientist looking through a microscope at the exact moment of the punch. They might just see physiological changes, right? Examining the sudden adrenaline spikes or the microscopic muscle contraptions of the men involved.
But that's missing the actual event.
Completely. Whitehead calmly explains that the true reality is the absolute unity of the action. It is the bodily collapse intrinsically tied to the psychological expression of anger.
They can't be separated.
No. The man's anger affects his own bodily functioning just as deeply and fundamentally as his physical fist upsets the stable functioning of his victim's body.
So you really cannot separate the physical event from the expressive impulse.
You can't. The unity of the event is what binds all those fragmented visual and auditory sensations together into something real.
I hear that, but you have to admit it's a massive paradigm shift. It directly challenges that extreme philosophical doctrine which argues that language is thought.
Oh, absolutely.
Because there are so many learned tests and modern theories that explicitly state, or at least tacitly presuppose, that a sentence literally is the thought.
Right.
But if we accept Whitehead's unified reality, equating language entirely with thought becomes this really dangerous and ultimately fragile oversimplification.
It is entirely fragile. Think about it. If you connect this to the broader human experience, if the sentence is the exact, complete equivalent of the thought itself, then translating between languages would be an absolute impossibility.
You just couldn't do it.
Every single translation would just be a completely different thought. Because not a single word, not a syllable, not even the order of succession remains the same when you move from English to Japanese or from Arabic to French.
The structures are totally different.
Exactly. The entire success of an imperfect translation relies on a core meaning that exists entirely independent of the grammar.
I mean, just think about the last time you had an idea that was crystal clear in your mind.
Yeah.
But when you tried to explain it to someone, maybe you're trying to comfort a grieving friend or trying to articulate this really complex emotion, the words just completely failed you.
We've all been there.
If language were the exact same thing as thought, you would never experience that agonizing frustration. You would only ever struggle to obtain the ideas in the first place. But we are all deeply conscious of having profound ideas that just remain verbally unexpressed.
Which brings us to this really beautiful central analogy he uses in the book, the stone in the pond.
It's such a striking image.
It's deeply contemplative. He says, a thought is a tremendous mode of excitement that hits our being like a stone being thrown into a quiet pond. It disturbs the entire surface of our existence.
But there's a paradox here.
Yes, and it's something you really have to sit with. You usually think the stone causes the ripples, and that's the end of the story. You have a thought, and then you express it.
Cause and effect.
Right. But Whitehead points out that the ripples, which represent your physical and emotional expressions, your pacing, your shouting, your quiet tears, Those ripples actually help create the plunge of the stone into the water in the first place.
So the expression isn't just a byproduct of the thought.
No, it's an active participant.
It's an active participant in forming the thought. The physical act of crying actually shapes the internal thought of sadness.
Precisely. The ripples release the thought, and then the thought augments and distorts the ripples. Thought constantly modifies its own expressive activities.
It's a feedback loop.
Exactly. Human activities, both emotional and physical, are vastly older than thought. They existed in our distant ancestors millions of years ago when conscious thought was merely slumbering in embryo.
So the whole notion of pure thought existing in some sterile vacuum,
Completely abstracted from all physical expression.
it's just a figment of the learned world. It
Oh,
totally
God.
ignores the reality of how we evolved.
And those expressions evolved over vast, unimaginable stretches of time. We really have to contrast the ancient, deeply organic nature of speech with the absolute artificiality of writing.
Speech is practically as old as human nature itself.
Yes.
Originally, it just fluctuated between raw emotional expression and primitive signaling. It was deeply tied to our moment-to-moment survival, a sudden shout to warn of a predator or a soft murmur to soothe a child.
While writing, on the other hand, is a very recent, highly constructed human technology.
It really is.
The book makes a striking comparison that puts this in perspective. Writing, as a factor in human experience, is as artificial and modern as the steam engine.
That's wild to think about.
Even if you allow for the faintest anticipations in primitive cave pictures, its history extends for less than 10,000 years. And as an effective instrument of thought with widespread societal influence, writing has only existed for roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years at the absolute most.
And the way you and I effortlessly intermingle speech and writing today feels so natural, feels so inherent to our daily experience. But it's an incredibly recent phenomenon in the grand scope of civilization.
Very recent.
Imagine walking down a city street just 500 years ago.
Yeah.
Mass illiteracy was the norm across most of the world. Society had to rely entirely on pictorial signs for inns and shops.
A wooden cutout of a boot for the cobbler.
Right, or a painted loaf for the baker. There was deep visual symbolism in religion, armorial bearings for great nobles, all of it acting entirely as a substitute for written words. The psychological immersion in written language, where you internalize a text in complete silence, that is completely new to the human brain.
And this profound transition from speech to writing closely mirrors the evolution of language from the immediate to the abstract.
How so?
Well, early language was desperately tied to the present environment. If our ancestors pointed out a bird, they were pointing to these particular birds right here and right now, amid these exact physical surroundings.
The immediate reality.
Right. The broader abstract genus of bird remained in the background of undiscerned meaning. The meaning was entirely anchored to the physical immediacy of the situation.
Contrast that with modern abstraction. Think about the word green. A French dictionary published in Paris defines green as a universal concept. It is completely detached from the political state of Europe, or the position of the planetary system, or the temperature of a specific spring morning. Green is just green wherever and whenever you are. It's an idea pulled entirely out of space and time.
And this abstraction has a dual nature, which is crucial to understand. On one hand, it is entirely responsible for the final uprise of human civilization. It gives you the ability to coordinate complex conceptual experiences.
It frees you from complete bondage to the immediacies of mood and circumstance.
Exactly. You can plan for a future you haven't even seen yet. But there is a profound danger here that Whitehead warns you about. Abstraction can lead quick-witted people far, far away from the realities of the immediate physical world.
You can get so lost in the abstraction of a spreadsheet.
Or the dictionary definition of an economic policy.
Yeah, that you completely forget the earth beneath your feet. You forget the actual human suffering involved. Spoken language is immersed in the immediacy of social intercourse, while written language lies hidden in a volume. Read in complete abstraction from your insistent surroundings.
Which is why ancient thinkers struggled so deeply with this exact tension, this friction between their profound insights and the limitations of their language.
They had these vast, magnificent thoughts about the evolution of the universe.
But they were trapped by the trivial presentation modes of their day. Look at Aristotle.
Right.
When he engaged in deep metaphysical reflection, trying to penetrate below the ordinary usages of the marketplace, he had to use the literal word woodhile to describe fundamental abstract aspects of reality like matter or substance.
The language of his time simply halted behind his intuition.
Exactly. And yet, despite these immense limitations, language is what ultimately elevated humanity. The mentality of mankind and the language of mankind essentially created each other in a continuous feedback loop.
The book concludes this long meditation on expression with a highly poetic, almost biblical reimagining. Instead of the traditional Genesis account, Whitehead suggests the sixth day of creation should simply be written. He gave them speech, and they became souls.
It's beautiful.
And if language really is what gives us our souls, it begs a massive question. How do those souls actually make sense of the vast universe they find themselves in? How do you or I actually understand anything at all?
Well, to begin with, you must address the enduring, highly destructive myth of complete understanding.
Oh, yes.
There is a humorous but deeply cautionary rhyme mentioned in the book about Dr. Whewell, the former master of Trinity College, Cambridge. It goes, "I am master of this college, and what I know not is not knowledge."
It's a funny little rhyme, but imagine actually living your life that way.
Mhm.
If I don't understand how my Wi-Fi router works, the concept of the internet simply isn't knowledge.
It's absurd.
It's a level of academic and personal arrogance that completely kills curiosity.
It's a devastatingly arrogant posture, and Whitehead quietly condemns it. This attitude completely sterilizes imaginative thought. It blocks progress by creating an artificial ceiling on inquiry.
Because understanding isn't a destination.
No, understanding is never a completed, static state of mind. It's not a final destination where you get to put down your pen and say, "I am finished." It is a continuous process of penetration that is always, by definition, incomplete and partial.
You only possess fuller self-knowledge when you realize you are engaged in an unending process of penetration.
Exactly, rather than when you feel the false, smug comfort of a completed job.
Because any knowledge of the finite always requires a reference to the infinite. The book uses Percy Bysshe Shelley's dramatic poem Hellas to illustrate this unimaginable vastness. The lines are, "Worlds on worlds are rolling ever, from creation to decay, like the bubbles on a river, sparkling, bursting, borne away."
It captures it perfectly.
Your finite knowledge, like knowing the color green or understanding a single mathematical equation, is just a tiny sparkling bubble relevant to a definite, entirely unexplored immensity.
And this is where the book levels a profound critique against the 19th century scientific mindset. And honestly, it's a critique that applies heavily to your modern world, too. Whitehead saw scientists acting like an anthill. Extreme specialization, while necessary for the development of civilized thought and technology, actually shrank minds in their width of comprehension.
Think about how we operate today. We have experts in highly specific subfields of technology or medicine who might completely miss the bigger picture of human well-being.
Because they are entirely zoomed in on one microscopic data point.
Right.
They obsess over criticizing and exploding these tiny details instead of striving to understand the vast, magnificent, or even hateful alternatives lurking in the background.
It's a trait that the ancient Greeks, the early Christian popes, and the founders of physical science possessed in much greater abundance.
They had that width of vision.
The 19th century, and arguably our century, knew immeasurably more facts than the ancients. But we have lost the vital sense of vast alternatives awaiting to overwhelm our safe little traditions.
So true.
To truly grasp how you regain that wider vision, you need to look at the actual mechanics of comprehension. The book outlines two entirely reciprocal modes of understanding.
Right, internal and external.
First, there is internal understanding. This is grasping the composition and the interweaving factors of a thing. It is understanding exactly why it is what it is as an internal outcome.
And the second is external understanding, which is treating the thing as a unity and understanding its capacity to actually affect its environment, how it acts as a causal factor in the wider world.
And these two modes are completely reciprocal.
Completely. Either one always presupposes the other. Nothing is finally understood until its reference to the broader process of the universe has been made evident.
You cannot understand a tree solely by looking at its cellular structure.
Exactly. You must understand how it interacts with the soil, the atmosphere, and the entire ecosystem.
And when you look at the realm of mathematics, you see a fascinating element of this comprehension in its purest form, the concept of self-evidence.
Self-evidence is so key here.
In math, the timefulness of time and the physical motion of approach are abstracted away entirely. It leaves ideal relationships displayed in timeless eternity. For instance, it is humbly self-evident to you that the addition of 1 and 4 produces the exact same multiplicity as the addition of 2 and 3.
You just know it.
You just know it with absolute clarity. You don't need to write out a massive multi-page proof for it. It just is.
But contrast your basic, limited self-evidence with the genius of the great Indian mathematician Ramanujan.
Oh, Ramanujan.
It was said that he experienced a self-evident, almost intimate friendship with the first 100 integers. His insight was immediate and profound. He could look at a number like 1729 and instantly delight in its complex patterns of relationship.
Knowing it is the smallest number expressible as the sum of two cubes in two different ways.
Right, patterns that the rest of us cannot naturally perceive without intense calculation. Where Ramanujan saw clear, immediate self-evidence, you and I would have to resort to what Whitehead controversially calls the indignity of proof.
The indignity of proof. Whitehead actually makes a claim here that feels entirely backwards to how we are taught to think. He argues that logical proof, the very thing we base all of modern science and rigid academic structure on, is actually a feeble, second-rate procedure.
It really raises a fundamental question about how you value human knowledge. Whitehead argues that proof is merely a tool. It's a crutch you fall back on when true, clear self-evidence fails you.
If you have to prove it step by step, it means you don't fully see it yet.
Exactly. Unless a proof actually produces self-evidence in your mind and thereby renders itself unnecessary, it merely results in a second-rate state of mind. It produces action completely devoid of real understanding. Logical proof always starts from premises, and those premises are always based on underlying self-evidence.
Therefore, philosophy shouldn't be obsessed with constructing elaborate, impenetrable proofs.
Because proof is inherently based on abstraction.
Right. Philosophy should attempt to minimize logical proof and focus purely on the sheer disclosure of self-evident truths concerning the nature of things. It should make you see the truth rather than just forcing you to agree with a syllogism.
But that noble attempt at sheer disclosure brings you right back to the ultimate failure of language in philosophy.
We always come back to language.
Because when you try to express the deeply self-evident, your words inherently fail you. The ordinary intercourse of mankind is concerned with shifting, trivial circumstances.
You didn't develop language to describe the cosmos.
No, hunting scenes were depicted on cave walls for thousands of years before permanent spatial relations became a topic for conscious analysis. When ancient religions required terms to express the ultimate unity of direction in the universe, they completely lacked the vocabulary.
So what did they do?
They had to borrow characteristics from vain, touchy, imperious human dictators and tyrants to describe their gods, because earthly power was the only reference point they had.
The language constantly halts behind the intuition. Your understanding completely outruns the ordinary usages of words. In this way, philosophy's struggle is incredibly akin to the struggle of poetry.
They are very similar endeavors.
Whitehead describes philosophy as the nearly impossible endeavor to find a conventional phraseology for the vivid suggestiveness of the poet. It is as if you were trying to reduce John Milton's breathtaking poem Lycidas into manageable conventional prose.
Hoping to somehow retain the profound symbolic meaning while making it useful for dry, academic connections of thought.
It is an imperfect penetration into our dim recognition of the world around us.
And within this infinitely complex world, you have to tackle the profound, undeniable reality of disorder, evil, and error.
Things go wrong.
Things go wrong, your plans fail, the notion of decay from better to worse is fundamentally baked into your existence.
And the book takes a very hard swing at monistic idealisms here, which is basically just a philosophical term for belief systems that argue everything in the universe is fundamentally one perfect, unified thing. Spinoza's great philosophy is the prime example of this.
Monistic idealisms are incredibly tempting. They weave this comforting fairy tale of perfectly adjusted factors, treating the absolute as a flawless whole. They try to brush frustration, confusion, and evil aside, categorizing them as mere secondary appendices.
Whitehead argues that's just a fairy tale. If everything is just one perfect whole, how do you explain war or sudden illness or the sheer chaotic misery that often defines the human condition?
You can't.
It is quite incredible and fundamentally illogical to assume that a perfect absolute would evolve confusion about its own details.
There is no reason to hold that order is somehow more fundamental than confusion. Whitehead argues that you must start from the notion that the universe fundamentally has two equally vital aspects.
The first being unity.
Right. First, there is a factor of unity. This involves the connexity of things, the overarching unity of purpose, and the unity of enjoyment. It is the vast, interconnected web of existence.
And second, there is a factor of multiplicity. The millions of individual actualities, you, me, the tree outside, each with its own unique experience, all enjoying life individually, yet all requiring each other to exist.
Exactly. And when you have this grand, overarching unity intersecting with the stubborn individuality of the many, conflict is not an accident.
It is entirely structural.
It is baked into the math of reality. By reason of the essential individuality of the many things, there are inevitable conflicts of finite realizations. Thus, the summation of the many into the one inherently involves disorder, conflict, and frustration.
Philosophy completely shirks its duty when it summarily dismisses one side of this dilemma. You are constantly navigating the friction between the unified whole and your own fragmented individual experience.
And because of this inherent friction, because you are a finite being operating within an infinite system of both unity and multiplicity, you can never achieve a state of full, total understanding.
You can only incrementally increase your penetration into the unknown.
When there is full understanding, when any particular item merely belongs to what is already perfectly clear, it ceases to be a discovery. It is just a static repetition of the known.
In that sense, complete understanding dissolves into tautology.
Thus, tautology is the intellectual amusement of the infinite, looking inward at its own perfect completeness. While for the finite individual, there is the beautiful, unending penetration into novelty. So opening up Alfred North Whitehead's book, Modes of Thought, there is this immediate, almost settling effect. You realize very quickly that you're in the hands of a thinker who really doesn't want to overwhelm you with that traditional impenetrable density you usually get in academic philosophy.
Right, he invites you to observe the very machinery of the universe, but to do so quietly. It is a distinctly serene, rigorous unpacking of how our minds actually process the world around us.
Yeah, and what draws you in is how the book attempts to coordinate two seemingly opposing views of existence. You have the perspective of the infinite and the perspective of the finite.
Exactly. It is an invitation for you to simply quiet the noise of the day, to sit still for a moment, and to look very closely at the invisible scaffolding of our thought processes.
I think the best place to begin looking at that scaffolding is the foundation of how we think. Whitehead brings up Professor Henry Sheffer of Harvard, and there is a subtle shift here that completely upends how we usually think about logic. We typically imagine logic as the ultimate consistency, the ultimate ordering and harmonizing of things.
But Whitehead notes that the foundation of logic is actually based on the concept of inconsistency. It starts with what cannot be together.
Which forces us to look at why inconsistency matters so deeply to our existence.
It does. Inconsistency introduces the very notion of the finite. Whitehead borrows this thought from Spinoza, who pointed out that to be finite means to explicitly exclude other things comparable to itself.
Let's unpack that a bit.
Sure. Consider a simple physical object. Imagine a heavy ceramic cup sitting on a wooden table. For that cup to exist exactly where it is in its finite reality, it must aggressively exclude another cup from occupying that exact same space.
Right.
To be finite is to draw a boundary in the universe. It is the physical and philosophical act of saying, I am occupying this exact coordinate and therefore you cannot be here.
It is almost an act of physical violence against every other possibility. And from that simple spatial reality, that boundary of inconsistency, we give birth to the massive logical concepts of negation and inference.
Yes, negation is simply our mind understanding what isn't there.
Yeah.
Because the finite object has excluded it.
And inference is our mind understanding what must be there, based on the shape and the shadow of those exclusions. It completely frames the movement of all logical thought.
And Whitehead connects this finite, exclusionary reality to our internal human emotion. He ties it specifically to the feeling of frustration.
Which is fascinating. Frustration isn't just a fleeting mood.
No, it is deeply, intimately tied to our finite mentality slamming into these physical and logical exclusions. We experience the world, and we constantly want to be in two places at once. We want two completely contradictory truths to coexist.
We want the cake, and we want to eat it.
Precisely. And we hit the hard, unforgiving wall of the finite. On the flip side of that emotion, when we dream in a harmonious conjunction, a reality where everything fits together without any painful exclusion, we are actually yearning for a monistic universe.
We're yearning for a perfectly unified reality without seams or borders. We spend our lives oscillating between the deep frustration of the finite and the intoxicating dream of the infinite.
Which naturally leads us to how the universe actually handles this incredible tension. The book introduces the concept of process as the answer.
Right. Process is described as this constantly shifting present. We are sitting here right now, and this exact second is entirely derived from the past, and it is actively, ceaselessly shaping the future.
Yet there are skeptics who argue that this feeling of process is a mere delusion, an illusion masking some unchanging, static unity of ultimate reality.
But Whitehead finds that denial of process to be completely inadequate.
He does. Because if ultimate reality is static and unchanging, how could it possibly generate such a vivid, relentless delusion of change within us? Instead, he argues that process is the essential interweaving of change and permanence. They require each other absolutely.
Think about your own identity over the course of your life. You are not the exact same person you were 10 years ago. Every cell in your body has changed. Your thoughts have shifted.
Yet there is a deep permanence that makes you undeniably you. That delicate interweaving of what stays and what fades, that is process.
So if we look back at those hard exclusions of the finite we were just talking about, the two cups that cannot occupy the same space, how does this interweaving process actually help us escape that frustration?
We escape it through time. Process is the specific mechanism the universe uses to escape the paralyzing limitations of the finite.
How so?
Imagine you have two completely inconsistent events. Let's call them event A and event B. Logically and physically, they cannot happen at the exact same time in the exact same space. The finite environment strictly excludes their conjunction.
Right, they clash.
But through the passage of time, through process, event A can happen on Tuesday and event B can happen on Wednesday. Process is the immanence of the infinite, breaking the shackles of the finite.
Wait, let's hold on to that phrase for a second because it is incredibly dense. The immanence of the infinite breaking the shackles of the finite. What does that actually look like for us?
It means the infinite isn't some distant realm out in the cosmos. It is immanent. It is operating right here, flowing through the present moment. Time acts as a solvent. It bursts the rigid bounds of the present, dissolving the inconsistencies that seem so absolute, so impossible to reconcile in a frozen moment.
Time allows the universe to hold contradictions by spacing them out.
Exactly.
That is a profoundly comforting way to view time. But when we try to communicate these unities, when we try to put this togetherness into language, we walk right into a trap.
We really do.
The book offers a fascinating critique of how we speak, noting that words expressing conjunction words like and, together, or class are absolute nests of ambiguity.
It is an invisible danger. We use the word and thousands of times a day without a second thought. But Whitehead warns that an admirable literary style is absolutely no security for logical consistency.
You can read a sentence expressed in the most perfect, sweeping, beautiful prose, and it can be a total logical death trap.
Because the word and might mean two entirely different types of togetherness in the exact same paragraph. One and might imply a strict spatial togetherness, while another might imply a loose sequential togetherness.
It highlights the fact that literature and logic are playing entirely different games. A beautifully balanced sentence might completely obscure the fact that the meanings of the words cannot actually exist together in the physical world. The poetry of the sentence seduces us into ignoring the logical contradiction.
Which is exactly why language can lead us into the perils of abstraction. We use our words to abstract, and we use our sciences to abstract, but we rarely pause to calculate the cost of doing so.
And this is where our usual assumptions are totally inverted. When we think of specialized science advancing, we naturally assume its relevance to the world is expanding. We are learning more, so we must understand more of the whole.
But the book argues the exact opposite. As a specialized scientific subject expands in its microscopic detail, its relevance to the broader lived universe actually contracts.
It contracts because specialized science, by its very nature, relies on highly rigid, artificially abstracted environments.
To study something in perfect isolation, you have to violently cut away the infinite complexity of the surrounding universe. You have to presuppose a strictly defined, sterile environment.
And the tragedy is that learned, brilliant people often handle this specialization with an incredible lack of precaution. They become so focused on the isolated variable that they forget the messy, infinite environment they cut away still exists and still influences reality.
He illustrates this with a thought experiment about geometry that really forces you to step outside your own sensory experience. We completely presuppose that the universe operates on a strict three-dimensional geometry, and it makes sense why we do.
Our primary sense of sight demands 3 dimensions. We see up and down, left and right, forward and backward. It feels like the absolute truth of space.
But we must ask, what if nature actually requires a 15-dimensional geometry to accommodate other types of occurrences?
That is a wild thought.
Consider human hearing, for example. Sound is not strictly three-dimensional in the rigid, exclusionary way a physical object is. Sound is voluminous, it is beautifully vague, it bleeds through walls and fills a space without defining precise geometric coordinates.
If our primary means of understanding the universe was through sound rather than sight, our mathematics and our geometry would look entirely different.
Because we have developed very special, biologically specific types of sensory observation, we are wedded to a correspondingly special set of limited results.
It makes you wonder about the value of sheer speculation. Imagine a future mankind eons from now, looking back at our era, looking back at our contracted, three-dimensional universe the exact same way we currently look back at flat Earth theories.
They might view our absolute, unyielding certainty in 3D geometry as quaint, recognizing that their wider existence emerged only when they broke free from our narrow, sight-biased view.
That kind of mythical speculation isn't just a fun exercise, though. It is a crucial defense mechanism against dogmatism.
Whitehead dissects dogmatism quietly, but he identifies it as the fatal virus of human intelligence. He outlines that there are fundamentally two types of advance in human understanding. The first is the safe advance.
This is where we gather new, little details and fit them neatly into our pre-assigned patterns. It is comfortable. It gives us the illusion of progress without ever challenging the underlying structure of our reality.
If that is the safe route, what is the alternative?
The alternative is the introduction of entirely novel patterns. This is the rare advance that takes the details we previously dismissed as irrelevant nonsense or anomalies and lifts them into a brand new vision of reality.
But the first type, the safe, dogmatic gathering of details, has repeatedly halted the intellectual evolution of mankind for centuries at a time.
But if dogmatism is such an obvious trap, why do the most brilliant minds in history fall into it? We aren't just talking about average thinkers getting stuck in their ways.
We are talking about towering figures: Epicurus, Plato, Aristotle, Kant. These are minds that shaped human civilization. But the tragedy of their genius is that they mistook their brilliant abstractions for the totality of reality.
Their dogmatic certainty in their own closed systems failed to survive the influx of knowledge over the last 2 centuries. Mathematics, as we understand it now, isn't perfectly true in the eternal, unchanging sense that Plato conceived it in his realm of forms.
And sense data isn't perfectly clear and primary in the way Epicurus believed.
The history of thought seems to be this heartbreaking mixture of vibrant, thrilling disclosure, followed immediately by deadening closure. The moment we favor the comfort and certainty of completed knowledge, we lose the vital, living sense of penetration and discovery.
Dogmatism assumes the abstraction is the whole truth, and in doing so, it kills the inquiry.
Which forces us to ask how we balance this tendency toward logical abstraction with the vividness of real life. How do we experience a world that is both rigidly structured and infinitely complex?
Whitehead gives us a profound distinction to help with this, separating inconsistency into 2 types: logical inconsistency and aesthetic inconsistency.
Let's visualize that. If we approach the world logically, think of a simple geometric grid. A red patch and a blue patch on that grid just represent sheer difference. They are logically inconsistent because they cannot occupy the exact same square at the exact same time.
But beyond that spatial conflict, they are functionally indifferent. You can swap the red patch for the blue patch, and the abstract geometric relationship of the grid remains perfectly mathematically intact.
But aesthetically, we're dealing with a completely different dimension of reality. Aesthetically, if you take a masterful painting and casually swap a blue patch for a red one, you don't just change a coordinate, you might completely destroy the entire composition.
The red is profoundly inconsistent with the concrete emotional and aesthetic effect produced by the blue.
But couldn't someone argue that art is purely subjective? Why does Whitehead treat this aesthetic inconsistency as a universal rule, almost on par with logic?
Because he isn't talking about subjective taste. He is talking about the concrete reality of the whole and how it impacts the environment. It reveals a directional difference in how our minds process the universe. Logic works from the bottom up.
It starts with tiny abstract details. When logic reads a book, it ignores the specific font, it ignores the width of the margins, it ignores the texture of the paper. It strips away the environment to take primitive ideas and build upward to a cold unity of construction.
But aesthetics works in the exact opposite direction. It works from the top down. When you walk into a breathtaking, centuries-old cathedral, you don't start by mathematically analyzing the mortar between the bricks or measuring the angles of the archways.
You are first completely overwhelmed by the total beauty of the whole. The light, the cold air, the scale of it, the totality discloses itself to you in a single, unified strike against your nervous system.
And only moments later, as your mind catches up, do your eyes pass to the discrimination of the specific details that made it beautiful. The whole precedes the details.
Exactly. Logic concentrates on high abstraction, moving safely away from messy reality, while aesthetics attempts to keep as close to the concrete lived fact as our finite understanding permits. They are the two extreme ends of our mentality, both trying to penetrate the infinite from different directions.
And understanding that directional difference is vital when we look at the next major theme of the book, which is perspective. The book takes us back to the Golden Age, this incredible 1,200-year period leading up to the Christian epoch.
You have Homer, Plato, Virgil, the Gospel of St. John. Human genius reached a culmination there that essentially paved the entire path for the next 1,800 years of European thought.
But we inherited a deeply defective insight from that brilliant past, and it is an insight rooted deeply in the very structure of our language. It is the illusion of isolation.
Because we use dictionaries where single words have neatly bounded definitions, and because we use syntax where sentences are bounded by full stops, we falsely believe that entities can exist completely abstracted from their environment. We think the full stop actually stops the connection.
The flaw of the full stop. We think we can understand a thing entirely on its own. And if we apply that to today, you can see how dangerous that flaw is. Look at modern digital communication or the atomization of our society.
We text each other in fragmented sound bites. We treat people, political ideas, and emotions like sentences bounded by full stops, stripped entirely of their context and environment. We assume the abstraction is the reality.
But the reality is that nothing is isolated. Every single entity contains its own perspective of the universe. The number 3 has a perspective of the universe. The color blue has a perspective.
A factual occasion, like the words being spoken right now, has a perspective. It is fundamentally connected to everything else, either as an accomplishment of the past or as a potentiality for the future.
The number 3 doesn't just float in a sterile void. It is a potentiality for 3 apples, 3 days, 3 dimensions. It is connected to the universe by what it has the power to qualify.
Which brings us to a beautiful dismantling of Plato's realm of forms. The ancient Greeks loved the idea of an eternal, self-sustaining realm of forms. A place of perfect numbers and pure concepts, completely devoid of the passage of time, devoid of loss, devoid of gain. A completely real, independent sphere of perfection.
But Whitehead gently points out that it is mere fantasy to impute absolute reality to something that is devoid of implications beyond itself. A form cannot be completely real on its own. Take something visceral like the form of mud.
The abstract form of mud requires actual physical mud to mean anything. Forms of evil require actual, tangible, evil things in the world to possess any reality.
Even the multiplication table up to 12 times 12 isn't just floating in a vacuum of perfection. It qualifies the course of history only when it is relevant to actual physical events.
Forms require realization. They require what he calls appetition.
Yes, appetition. It is hunger, desire, hope, fear, intention. It is life itself. The abstract requires the pulse of life to give it weight.
And this gives us the definitions for the two extremes of existence that absolutely require each other. On one end, you have actuality, which is the physical, matter-of-fact exemplification of potentiality.
On the other end, you have pure potentiality, which is the characterization of actuality. Potentiality is the infinite realm of what could be, the unending alternatives.
Actuality is the finite, exclusionary realization of one of those alternatives. You cannot have the abstract concept without the concrete life that breathes meaning into it.
It is a delicate balance.
And that leads us to such a provocative, lingering thought to sit with. Whitehead makes the claim that philosophy is not just some special study locked away in an ivory tower. He says, as we think, we live. So I want you to consider that for a moment. If every single abstraction we use, our numbers, our logic, our aesthetic judgments, the very words we speak, is not isolated, but is tied directly to our hopes, our fears, and the very structure of our civilization, how does that change the way you view your everyday interactions when you realize that your individual perspective is just one finite intersection of an infinite reality?
Realizing that our current mode of reality is just one perspective is precisely what prepares us for the unending types of existence yet to be discovered. It removes the dogmatic blindness that halts human progress. And the ultimate evidence for these intersecting modes of reality isn't found in abstract mathematical proofs or isolated logical puzzles. It is found in our shared civilized intercommunication. It is found in our laws, our moral habits, our literature, our art. These messy, concrete social structures act as the living, breathing evidence that our individual perspectives are constantly reaching out, interweaving with the perspectives of others, forming a composite reality that is always in process, always shifting, and constantly pointing towards something deeply connected to the... As you sit there, just listening to the quiet space around you, I want you to consider for a moment the sheer, unbelievable contrast between what could be and what actually is. We are stepping directly back into the profound architecture of Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy in this book, continuing our exploration into the very modes of existence. We're looking at the world exactly as it is disclosed in your human experience. Specifically, we're looking at the tension between potentiality, that infinite shimmering realm of what might happen, and actuality, the concrete, unyielding reality of what is happening right now.
Yeah, because to truly understand actuality, we have to decode how we actually experience the world around us, which is, it's such a grounded place to start. Historically, the learned world spent centuries debating whether actuality is made of these invisible substances or happenings or some grand absolute. But the author brings us back to something much more immediate, much closer to the bone, far removed from those dusty academic debates. He suggests that our direct human experience naturally splits into two massive divisions. And the first is something you're experiencing right at this very second, which is bodily and qualitative experience.
I love how visceral that is. So this first division is just the raw, complex, vague, and intensely compulsive feeling of simply being alive.
Exactly.
It's the realization of your essential connection with the physical world, but also the undeniable weight of your own individual existence in this exact moment. Think about the intimate mutual adjustment happening inside you right now. Your brain, your heart, your lungs, your breathing.
They are yours.
Yes, and they're operating with this incredibly tight, intense intimacy. The book points out a beautiful contrast here. The sunrise you see in the morning is a message from the world beyond. It completely lacks that direct, entangled intimacy of your own internal biology.
It's a fundamental difference in how we relate to reality. The sunrise is out there, but your heartbeat is right here. And when you sit with that thought, it explains why psychology and physiology are so incredibly difficult to separate from one another.
Yeah, whether you're an abstract scientist or a medical doctor.
Right. The behavior systems of your physical human body and the flux of your intimate emotional feelings are hopelessly, beautifully entangled. This first division of experience is heavy. It carries the weight of the past, the intensity of the present, and the conditioning of the future. It's a vague but imperative throb of existence.
The throb of existence.
But then we arrive at the second division of human experience. This one belongs strictly to higher animals and humans, and it operates on completely different rules.
Let me see if I had this right, because sense perception seems to invert every single emphasis of that first bodily division.
It really does.
Where bodily experience is intimate, intense, and kind of beautifully vague, sense perception is clear, distinct, but surprisingly indifferent. When you look at a wall and see a specific shade of blue, or you hear a distinct tone of a bell, you are discerning forms and qualities. You are discerning spatial and temporal forms, like how far away the wall is, or how long the bell rings.
That is the perfect way to phrase it, and the book actually calls this the triumph of abstraction in animal experience. Let's break down what abstraction really means here because it's vital.
Go ahead.
In sense perception, we are extracting specific qualities from the messy emotional cargo of actual reality. The shade of blue doesn't have an inherent emotion, it is just itself. Any emotional effect it has on you, say it reminds you of the ocean or a childhood bedroom, is a secondary derivative.
It awakens a reaction, but the blue itself is completely devoid of impulse.
Exactly. Sense perception gives us three distinct gifts: an approach to accuracy, a sense of qualitative differentiation in the outside world, and this is crucial in neglect of essential connections.
A neglect of essential connections. That sounds almost dangerous.
It is, in a way.
It means that to focus on the exact shade of blue, you have to actively ignore the vast interconnected web of reality that surrounds it. You have to isolate it, cut it off. Which brings us to what feels like a monumental critique of pure science and logic in the text.
Right, because Aristotelian logic, and indeed modern scientific practice, is entirely founded on this second division.
It is founded on the practice of omission. To observe something accurately under a microscope, you have to dismiss everything else in the universe from your consciousness as irrelevant.
Which raises an incredibly important question, because as the book argues, there is actually no true irrelevance in the universe.
Everything is touching something else.
All things are fundamentally connected.
Right.
So the whole of science is, in a way, based on neglected modes of relevance. It systematically omits the environmental coordinations that give things their true holistic context. Over the last few centuries, this intense emphasis on higher sense perception, like exact sights, sounds, and measurements, has actually damaged our philosophical development. The profound, open-ended question of what do we know slowly degraded into the dogmatic, limited question of what can we know.
And the dogmatic answer became, we can only know what fits into strict space and time patterns. There's this calm but undeniable revolt in the text against the idea that the universe can be entirely unlocked just by arithmetic, topology, or the multiplication table.
Yes.
The author really pushes back against the notion that numerical relations hold the one fundamental key to understanding the nature of things. Arithmetic and topology, the study of geometric properties and spatial relations are just specialties. They are abstractions.
They leave out the throb of existence we talked about.
Exactly. If we want to understand the messy creative process that we call our lives, we need principles that are larger and far more penetrating than just numbers.
We have to start from the fundamental modes that dominate our actual experience. The author suggests 3 great pairs of opposites that characterize our experience: clarity and vagueness, order and disorder, and the good and the bad.
Those feel very foundational.
They are. And when we look at these pairs, there is a very natural, almost instinctive affinity between order and goodness. We naturally associate a clear, orderly mind with something positive, something capable of maintaining society and foresight.
It makes sense. You never hear someone being accused of orderly conduct as a crime.
Right.
We praise order because while we can definitely overdo order, mere disorder results in a total non-entity of achievement. If there's no order, nothing gets built, nothing is sustained. The book mentions that the most famous lecture in the entire history of European thought was delivered by Plato over 2,300 years ago. The topic was the good.
Yeah.
And what did Plato naturally focus on to explain the good? Mathematics.
Just imagine being in that ancient audience. You show up to hear the great philosopher talk about the good expecting profound moral guidance, maybe something about justice or the soul, and instead he gives you a lecture on mathematics.
It seems incredibly jarring at first glance.
Very. What does the multiplication table have to do with the moral beauty of a selfless act? But when you consider the development of human consciousness, how we rose from the confused, vague satisfactions of our animal ancestors to a state of clarity, mathematical understanding stands out as a primary example of insight into the nature of order.
And therefore, insight into the good.
Exactly. To truly grasp this, we have to look at the difference between animal enjoyment and human understanding.
And to do that, we get to walk through one of the most vivid and touching anecdotes in the entire book.
It's
The story of the mother squirrel at the Vermont lake camp.
I love this part.
Paint this picture in your mind. There's a charming, quiet cabin in the woodland bordering a lake. A mother squirrel has made her nest in a hole in the brickwork right around the fireplace of the main sitting room. She comes and goes, completely ignoring the human family living there, simply tending to her young in the dark warmth of the chimney.
Then, one day, she decides her family has grown beyond the nursery stage. It's time to move. One by one, she carries her babies out to the edge of the woodland, placing them on a rock outside. There were 3 babies in total. But when the mother finished moving them, she looked at the family group on the rock and then back at the nest, and she became vaguely disturbed. She began running frantically back and forth, checking the empty nest, checking the rock.
Because she couldn't count.
Right.
She didn't have names for her children.
Right.
All she knew was that the vague multitude of her family sitting out in the open on the rock felt somehow different than the vague multitude she was used to experiencing inside the dark enclosed nest.
It was a different visual and tactile arrangement.
Exactly. She enjoyed the structure of her family. She felt the deep bodily intimacy of her young, that first division of experience we talked about, but she couldn't understand the structure. She lacked the exact limitation imposed by number.
The psychological mechanism at play there is just fascinating. Because she couldn't count to 3, she could only feel a mild, vague disturbance. If that mother squirrel had crossed the borderline of civilization into mathematical abstraction, if she could have counted 1, 2, 3, her experience would have been infinitely more vivid.
Vivid in a good way or a bad way?
Both. She would have experienced the sharp, determinate satisfaction of a job well done in successfully relocating 3 specific children. Or, tragically, if a predator had taken one, she would have suffered the vivid, exact pain of a specific, determinate loss.
So because she lacks that abstract concept of three, she's spared the exactness of grief, but also denied the exactness of triumph. That boundary, that finite number, is the human edge. Think about that shift for early humans. The moment a vague multitude of things turned into an exact number. That was a monumental leap. Suddenly, we had selective emphasis.
It's what allows us to define finite occasions clearly.
Right. Exact forms of limitation are exactly what allow humans to vividly experience the good and vividly experience the bad. Without the boundary of the finite, everything washes into a vague, muddy emotion. Which makes me think about how often we actually try to escape those boundaries, leading right into this massive philosophical deconstruction of how we romanticize the infinite.
You do romanticize it quite a bit. In discussions of deep religious or mystic experiences, people often place this unbalanced, overwhelming emphasis on the pure sense of infinitude.
The idea of becoming one with the boundless universe.
Exactly. But the book argues that any being entirely overwhelmed by a sense of the infinite would actually rank lower in consciousness than that mother squirrel. True realization, true existence, requires finitude. And finitude means exclusion.
It means drawing a line.
Drawing a line. It means being this specific thing and explicitly not being that other thing.
So if we just focus on the finite, just what's right in front of us, without any broader context, life gets pretty trivial, right?
Highly trivial.
It turns into that cynical, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die mindset. It's meaningless isolation. But if I'm hearing you correctly, swinging too far the other way into the purely infinite is just as bad.
It's just a vacuous, mystic slumber. There are no edges, no definitions, no progression. True importance, the full solemnity of the world, arises from a beautiful fusion. It is the positive achievement of the finite fact, combined with the infinite perspective of the universe stretching out beyond it.
Every finite fact requires the infinite universe to express its relevance.
To have a backdrop against which it matters, but it must remain a specific finite fact. This fusion is why the transitions within history, the actual events of our daily lives, matter so deeply. And this leads us to challenge a very deep-seated assumption about order.
We established earlier that clarity and order are naturally associated with the good, because they allow us to foresee situations and maintain society.
But the text warns us that order is simply not enough.
We actually must incorporate vagueness and disorder. If you are entirely trapped in mere conformity, in perfect, unbroken order, life degenerates. It's like being stuck in a rut where nothing ever changes.
You slowly decay.
You need a mechanism to handle the unforeseen. You need disorder for progress, for novelty, and for the sheer excitement of living. A power to incorporate vague and disorderly elements into our experience is absolutely essential if we're ever going to advance into the new. Without it, creation itself becomes meaningless.
Taking a step back to look at the broader history of philosophy, we see a lingering illness regarding this exact point. It's a historical hangover from Greek philosophy and the decadent empires of the past.
What kind of hangover?
There has been this tired, exhausted obsession with a static, changeless absolute. Because Greek mathematics focused on static geometric forms and numbers that never changed, their philosophy began to equate ultimate perfection with a lack of motion. The universe was conceptualized as frozen into motionless perfection.
And when you freeze the universe into changeless perfection, you accidentally degrade our actual messy, changing historic world into mere shadows. You make action, turmoil, and change seem like inferior illusions.
When in reality, they are the essence of existence.
We live in a world of turmoil. The book argues that dismissing turmoil and change is the outcome of tired decadence, the exhaustion of civilizations that are decaying and just want things to stand still. We need a philosophy that explains the rise of order, the chaotic transitions from one type of order to another, and the tangled mixture of good and bad that is self-evident in our daily lives.
To conceptualize this dynamic, intertwined reality, the author uses a truly powerful metaphor that pulls all of these threads together.
The concert hall.
The concert hall. Imagine you are sitting in a grand concert hall. Think about what psychologists call your specious present.
It's a specious present.
Yeah, it's not just a microscopic millisecond of now, but a block of time you experience all at once, like hearing a chord in music rather than just isolated notes. In that immediate present, there's the sheer volume of sound hitting your ears. That's the immediate physical reality.
Right.
But existing simultaneously with that sound is the symphonic form, the musical structure that is unfolding into your expectation of the future. You feel where the music is going.
And wrapping around all of that is the past. You have the creative genius of the composer who wrote the piece centuries ago, the multitude of artists in the orchestra bringing their lifetime of practice to this moment.
The conductor.
The shape of the physical instruments carved from wood decades ago, the mathematical analysis of the acoustics of the hall itself. Past, present, and future are all layered on top of each other, existing in the exact same moment of experience. Immediate existence absolutely refuses to be separated from its past or cut off from the future it is building toward.
So let's map the author's 4 main modes of experience onto our concert hall. Rather than just listing them, let's walk through them.
Okay.
That first mode, the aesthetic mode, that's the raw genius of the music hitting you. It's the disclosure of the form, and even the inevitable frustration when a note is missed or the forms clash.
That's the feeling.
Yes, but then you shift to the second mode, the matter-of-fact mode. This is where you experience the unity of the orchestra, the multitude of the individual players, and the physical transition of the sound waves moving through the air.
And then there's the third mode, the division mode. This brings us back to those 3 great pairs of opposites we discussed earlier. In the concert hall, you experience the clarity of a solo violin against the vagueness of the background harmony. You hear the order of the rhythm, and maybe the intentional disorder of a dissonant chord. You feel the good of a beautiful movement, and perhaps the bad of an uninspired section.
Which brings us to the fourth and final mode, existence. Sitting in that hall, you are understanding eternal forms like the mathematical truth of harmony existing both in potentiality before they are played and in realized fact as you hear them.
It's the profound understanding that the past lives entirely within the immediate present.
And the present contains a deep, unavoidable hunger and appetition towards the unrealized future. The way we deal with these 4 interwoven modes determines not just the shape of our philosophy, but the actual minute-by-minute practice of our lives.
It's a complete shift in how you view a single moment, which transitions us perfectly into examining the forms of process themselves. How do small unities in the universe build into larger ones?
Right.
It begins with microscopic throbs of pulsation. Those pulsations organize into molecules. Molecules organize into stones, into plants, into the complex lives of animals and humans. And eventually, these unities build all the way up into what we call the vast laws of nature.
And here we run into Descartes. Descartes tried to understand the universe by focusing on the concept of perfection.
Perfection.
But the book argues that perfection is far too limited and far too ambiguous. It implies a static, unchanging endpoint, which we've already established goes against the very nature of a living universe. Descartes should have focused on a much more expansive concept, the concept of importance.
How does importance for the finite universe require importance for the infinite universe?
Exactly. To understand that shift from perfection to importance, we have to trace the transition from accident to necessity.
Think about a single spoken sentence in a lecture. That specific sentence has a huge element of accident to it. The speaker could have chosen a dozen different words, or paused, or cleared their throat. But the lecture as a whole has a kind of necessity. It reflects the speaker's entire life, their background, their epoch, their environment. That epoch is derived from the evolution of life on Earth, which in turn depends on the order of the entire spatio-temporal stellar system.
It scales up infinitely. But then the book drops a truly profound realization on us. We look at that stellar system, we look at what we call the laws of nature, and we assume they are absolute.
We treat them as permanent.
We assume they are the final, unyielding rules of the game. But they aren't. The laws of nature have no final necessity whatsoever.
That is staggering to think about.
They are simply the forms of activity that happen to prevail within the specific vast epoch of time we currently inhabit. They are essentially habits of the universe.
Habits of the universe. Imagine the sheer scale of those epochs. This brings us to the profound paradox of epochs. The universe requires adequate stability of order, because complete confusion is complete frustration.
We couldn't exist without the laws of nature holding true for now.
We need gravity to work today just like it worked yesterday. Yet, history shows us that forms of order transition. One epoch gives way to another. The universe absolutely refuses the deadening influence of complete permanent conformity. The frustration of established order, the introduction of vibrant novelty, is the very essence of life and excitement.
We are constantly oscillating between the aim at order and the aim at novelty. There's a rhythm of process at play here, creation producing natural pulsations, where each pulsation forms a natural unit of historic fact.
It's a rhythm.
A rhythm of process.
And as we contemplate this rhythm, this continuous beating pulse of creation that builds reality out of the void, it forces us to look back at the foundational physics that supposedly define our reality.
Which smoothly exposes the fundamental flaw in the Newtonian description of matter.
Exactly, specifically how Newton abstractly severed matter from time itself. When you look closely at the world around you, it is incredibly tempting to see a collection of static, unchanging facts.
It really is. We assume things are fixed.
Exactly. Think about how we view our daily lives or our careers or our relationships. We often treat them as these quiet, permanent states of being. You might say to yourself, I am a lawyer, or we are married.
Right, or, this is my house.
Yes, assuming these things simply exist in a quiet state of absolute permanence. But if you sit patiently and quietly with Alfred Whitehead's book, Modes of Thought, a completely different, profoundly dynamic vision begins to softly unfold before you.
It's a beautiful vision.
It really is. This book gently guides you to realize that the universe is not made of inert objects resting silently in time. Rather, reality is composed of continuous, beautifully intertwined processes. Reality itself is a fluid, breathing sequence of events, and to truly understand existence, we have to understand this unceasing flow.
It is a profoundly beautiful shift in perspective. The book asks you to look far past the surface of what seems fixed and to examine the very anatomy of a fact. Any fully realized unit of fact, any singular moment of existence, is never simply a thing existing in total isolation.
It's always moving.
Right. It is instead an active living process that involves three essential interwoven components. These are data, transition, and issue. We must slowly and carefully unpack what these components mean, starting with data.
Good data.
Yes. In this highly contemplative philosophical framework, the data for any single pulsation of reality is not a mere number. It's not, a figure on a spreadsheet, nor is it a simple, isolated observation. It is the full, infinite content of the antecedent universe.
That's massive.
It is. The data consists of everything that has been, everything that might have been, and everything that may be. It is the vast, overwhelming multiplicity of the entire past arriving at the doorstep of the present moment.
Let me make sure I'm holding this concept correctly, because it is quite vast. As that infinite wave of data arrives at the present, it enters the second phase, which is the transition.
Exactly.
And the book describes this transition as what we experience as the specious present. So, in plain English, we are not talking about a frozen snapshot of time like a photograph. We are talking about a deeply active process of composition and gradation.
The raw elements of the past are actively being woven together right now.
Right now, yes. But what I find so fascinating here is that this transition is crucially a process of elimination.
That's a huge point.
The present moment forms itself not just by what it includes, but by what it leaves behind. Every detail that becomes actual involves the deliberate elimination of elements in the data that simply cannot be reconciled with the emerging reality.
And that concept of elimination is absolutely vital to understand, because elimination is a positive fact in itself. The background of discarded data, the silent ghosts of what did not come to pass, adds a deeply palpable tone of feeling to our present reality.
A tone of feeling. I like that.
The book offers a fascinating historical example to illuminate this carefully. You cannot fully understand the history of the European races in North America without feeling the immense weight of what was narrowly avoided.
A Spanish domination.
Yes, you must reference the double failure of Spanish domination. Specifically, the escape from their hold over England in the 16th century and their waning grip over California in the 19th century. The sheer narrowness of that escape quietly but forcefully shapes the reality of the present.
That is such a relatable way to frame history. It makes me think about how we view our own lives, too. The reality of who you are today is entirely colored by the alternate histories you narrowly escaped.
The ones you left behind.
Right. The job offer you turned down. The city you decided not to move to. It is the elimination of those alternate histories that gives your lived history its specific resonating tone. No fact of history, personal or global, is truly understood until you deeply know what it has narrowly escaped. And that sense of a narrow escape, of a reality actively composing itself against the backdrop of discarded possibilities, it stands in stark contrast to the restrictive fables often told by modern science. The book uses such striking, quiet imagery to illustrate this difference. It insists that the universe is absolutely not a museum.
No, it is not a silent hall where perfectly preserved specimens rest forever in glass cases, completely immune to the passage of time. Nor is the universe a perfectly drilled regiment, marching strictly in step with undisturbed poise.
That's the fable.
Yes, those notions, the static glass cases, the flawless, unchanging marching regiment, they belong entirely to the fable of modern science. Now, it is a highly useful fable, certainly, for dealing with large average effects and making broad, generalized observations, but it remains a fable nonetheless.
Because things are never truly still.
Exactly. A completed fact is never truly static. It immediately takes its place as active data, flowing forward and forming the future. A scientific conclusion never survives unmodified by the radical ongoing increase in the delicate subtleties of our knowledge.
That brings us to a beautiful, meticulous deconstruction within the book that I think will surprise anyone who grew up memorizing times tables. We always assume math is just dead, static fact. To truly disprove the fashionable idea that mathematics is merely a tautology, a system of static, self-evident truths, we have to look closely at arithmetic.
It's a great exercise.
Just let your mind rest on a remarkably simple phrase. Twice 3 is 6. What could possibly be more permanent than that? But the book explains that twice 3 is not a static truth at all. It is a description of a highly specific process of fusion.
To vividly illustrate this process, we can sit with one of the book's gentle analogies. Imagine 3 drops of water, each held quietly together by its own delicate skin of surface tension.
Okay, I have them.
Now, bring them into a process of fusion with another group of 3 drops of water. What is the actual issue of this process? The 6 drops might slowly and beautifully coalesce into one single massive drop. Or the energy of the collision might shatter them entirely, resulting in a fine mist of 50 tiny drops.
Wow.
The arithmetic phrase, twice 3 is 6, assumes that the specific principle of individuation, the distinct, separate nature of the original drops, is kept completely undisturbed during the transition. The numbers merely characterize the way a group's unity is attained through a process.
Wait, that is absolutely brilliant. So if they shatter into 50 drops, the twice 3 process failed to maintain the individual units.
Precisely.
There's another wonderful analogy in the book regarding this vaguely interpreted principle of individuation that makes it even clearer. Imagine a doctor prescribes you a dose of medicine, instructing you to take 2 teaspoons. But in reality, when you go to your kitchen, you take the medicine using a single dessert spoon.
Which we all do.
Right. The actual physical individualization into 2 distinct teaspoons was never achieved in the physical world, yet the essence of the process was entirely fulfilled. When we say twice 3 is 6, we are simply saying that the issue of a fluent process is an entity with the overarching character of 6.
Yes.
By framing it this way, we are profoundly challenging Plato's mood, the mood where he believed mathematics belonged to a changeless, static eternity devoid of life, warmth, and motion.
By returning that breath of life and motion to form, we gently transition into the book's majestic concept of a supreme being. And we must be careful here because this is not conceived as a static deity sitting perfectly still on a cloud outside the bounds of time.
Not at all.
Rather, the supreme being is in actuality actively in the process of composition. It is an infinite reservoir of conceptual potentiality. It acts to quietly coordinate achievement and, most beautifully, it sustains the universe's aim at vivid experience. It fuses its infinite potential with the data received from the world process, preserving identities through the vast, unimaginable stretches of time, yet always allowing for the absolute necessity of change.
And the specific way identities are preserved through time is so carefully nuanced in the book. Identities endure, of course, but only partially, and only for very specific purposes.
Right.
The book unpacks this through an incredibly resonant analogy. Consider a baby of 10 months, and then imagine that same person is a fully grown man of 30 years. For the legal purpose of inheriting real estate, their identity is entirely identical. The law looks at the paperwork and sees the 30-year-old man as the exact same entity as the infant.
The identity holds up perfectly there.
But consider that same 30-year-old man trying to navigate a yacht through stormy waters. In that highly specific, demanding process, the immense physical, emotional, and cognitive differences between the child and the adult are a literal matter of survival. In the context of steering the yacht, their legally shared identity sinks into complete metaphysical irrelevancy.
Because identities are only ever partially preserved depending on the process, the laws of nature themselves are inevitably subject to modification. Nothing is perfectly immune. As identities slowly decay and continuously reform, species flourish and eventually fall. Great civilizations rise, reach their stunning zeniths, and gently, inevitably decay. Even the massive heavenly bodies gradually form and pass slowly through their extraordinarily long sequences of stages.
What I find truly fascinating is the human emotional reaction to these shifts in the laws of nature. If you quietly observe your own life, you will notice that we easily accept the slow drift. Think about how you look in the mirror every single day. You accept that slow, gradual shift as you age.
It's barely perceptible.
Right. The gradual turning in the seasons, the slow fading of a memory, we absorb these with quiet acceptance. But when human nature is suddenly confronted with quick, violent changes, we pass into a state of absolute hysteria.
Yes, the book points directly to gales, thunderstorms, devastating earthquakes, destructive fires, and rapid social revolutions. When the established forms of process are fundamentally disturbed at a rapid pace, our emotional reaction is incredibly energetic and panicked. We experience these rapid breakdowns of lawful order as though heaven is suddenly dawning or the earth is yawning open to reveal hell before us. We desperately cling to the stability of the ongoing process, and we panic when its rhythm violently breaks.
If we follow this thread of continuous flowing transition, we must smoothly carry our contemplation forward into dismantling a profound fallacy, the fallacy of a point and process.
A very persistent fallacy.
It really is. The book calmly asks you to completely let go of the idea of a moment in time devoid of temporal spread. Imagine trying to isolate the exact stroke of noon on a specific day without allowing it any duration whatsoever. It is an absolute impossibility. Similarly, the concept of a point in space completely devoid of extension is a falsehood. Space is not made of infinitely small, dead dots. Spatial extension, as the book beautifully phrases it, is the ghost of transition.
It is a truly stunning, haunting phrase. Spatial extension is only to be experienced by some ongoing process of transition. If you attempt to separate process from individuality, all meaning simply evaporates into nothing. But we have to acknowledge that this introduces a deep philosophical paradox, one the book faces with quiet, unwavering honesty.
The paradox of logic.
Exactly. If every individual thing actively infects the very process it is involved in, if the process is entirely dependent on the specific individuals participating, then how can we ever rely on generalized logic? How can mathematics or scientific induction have any security at all if changing the individual changes the entire process?
The book addresses this paradox through the gentle, clarifying lens of common sense. It asks you to contrast two very different types of study. No one would study the heavy physical science of geology as a preparation to appreciate the delicate emotional structure of Shakespeare's sonnets or the complex mathematical harmonies of Bach's fugues.
There are completely different realms.
The individuals in these processes, the rocks, the magma, the tectonic plates, are so fundamentally different from the written words of a sonnet or the played notes of a fugue. The interconnections are vastly, incomparably different.
And yet, amidst this inescapable, overwhelming diversity of process, faint analogies do occur. Civilized thought and the entirety of rationalism are built precisely on the quiet discovery of these faint analogies. The ancient Greeks, for instance, discovered profound, enduring analogies between the physical, measured lengths of vibrating strings and the unseen, beautiful harmonies of musical notes. They found quiet analogies between the physical dimensions of a stone building and the abstract, internal feeling of structural beauty. We learn to understand the world by finding these faint identities amidst the overwhelming, chaotic diversity of process.
But to find those identities, to allow for the universe to be anything more than a fleeting, chaotic illusion, requires an understanding of potentiality. Delving deeply into the book, you realize that potentiality is fundamental for the very existence of anything at all.
It has to be.
If the universe were truly static and dead, potentiality would vanish completely. Everything would just be exactly what it is, forever, with no room to grow. But because process is fundamental, the present moment is the realization of the potentialities of the past, and it serves as the fertile storehouse for the potentialities of the future.
This deep, aching need to relate static form to active, historic process is a hidden undercurrent flowing through the entire history of human thought. You can see it secretly harboring in Newton's firm belief in absolute space. You can see it in Bacon's scientific inductions, in Plato's transcendent realm of forms, and in Leibniz's monads.
They were all searching for it.
Yes, all of these great minds were attempting to reconcile the quiet potentiality of form with the active, messy realizations of history.
Wait, just to make sure we don't lose anyone in the philosophy here, when we talk about Plato's realm of forms or Leibniz monads, we are basically talking about early attempts to figure out how perfect, unchanging ideas connect to a world that is constantly moving and decaying, right?
Exactly. Gently put, Leibniz imagined the universe made of tiny, indivisible, independent units he called monads, while Plato imagined a perfect realm of ideas that our world only loosely copies. They were all trying to anchor the flowing process of reality to something stable, and this delicate reconciliation gently guides you into the presence of Samuel Alexander's monumental triad, a concept the book pauses to embrace with immense reverence.
Space, time, and deity.
That's the triad. Let us take an abundance of time to sit quietly with each of these three pillars of reflective thought. First, there is time. Time is the very essence of transition. Without it, everything is reduced to a mere dead fact. Time is the home of purpose. It is the cradle of our hope, the long shadow of our fear, and the driving, relentless force of energy.
And then we must softly turn to consider space. If time is the active transition, space is the necessary halt for attainment. It is the consummation of the process, the physical fact of accomplishment. Space symbolizes the deep, layered complexity of immediate realization. Time and space together express a living universe that includes both the ongoing essence of transition and the concrete, physical success of momentary achievement. The transition is profoundly real, and the achievement is profoundly real.
Finally, we arrive at deity. In this philosophical context, this is the crucial lure of the ideal. It is the factor in the universe that creates importance, value, and a transcendent reality far beyond the mere actual facts of existence. It is what saves us from a barren, solipsistic existence.
Let's pause there. When you say it saves us from a solipsistic existence, you mean it saves us from a reality where we believe nothing exists outside our own individual minds, correct?
Precisely. If you are a true solipsist, living in a universe where only your immediate personal experience existed, you could never actually succeed or fail. There would be no external standard of comparison whatsoever. Deity provides that transcendent external worth. It is the unified, quiet source of ideals against which human experience explicitly measures itself, allowing us to perceive both the glorious success and the tragic defacement of our highest aims.
You can deeply contrast this profound reflective experience of humans, an experience that intricately intertwines spatial association, temporal origination, and deistic ideals with the experience of animal life. For the most part, the book suggests animal life is a dumb passage from immediacy to immediacy, devoid of the deep illumination of higher reflection.
It lacks that external standard.
Yes, but human thought holds the spatial experiences of joint association, the temporal experiences of looking back at our origin and looking forward to our future determination, and the deistic experiences of aiming at an ultimate ideal.
This profound distinction perfectly articulates the stark, quiet difference between science and history. Science, as the book carefully explains, investigates the dead facts of bygone transitions. It looks backward, attempting to predict the future only in terms of the static forms of past achievement. But history is fundamentally different. History relates the perpetual novelty of the aim at ideals. History is the living, breathing drama of existence.
And what bridges the two? What gently transforms the dead, categorizes facts of science into the living, unpredictable drama of history. It is the religious, deistic impulse of energy. As a present epic eventually decays in futility or quiet frustration, this deistic influence softly implants within the historic process new aims, driving existence toward entirely novel forms of order.
It's a continuous renewal.
It is because of this transcendent, energetic impulse that science can never fully foretell the perpetual, ever-renewing novelty of history. We are always stepping into the unknown.
This profound understanding of a universe driven by ideals naturally and quietly shifts the discussion into the opening thoughts of what the book titles Lecture 6, Civilized Universe. Here, you are invited to see that philosophy is inherently the search for premises. Philosophy is not merely a mechanical process of logical deduction. It is the careful, endless, quiet search for the very starting points of our thought.
And it is the special sciences that take these broad philosophical assumptions and intentionally narrow them. The sciences achieve their comparative clarity by purposefully ignoring extraneous variables. They isolate their topics, presuming that vast, complex portions of the universe are simply irrelevant to their specific, focused study.
But this isolation is incredibly fragile. As these special sciences proceed with their logical deductions, resting comfortably on the quiet certainty of their narrowed premises, there is a lingering danger in the background. Because the universe is so profoundly and quietly interconnected, there is no ultimate logical guarantee that the very deductive procedure itself, as it continuously builds and elaborates upon its own complex compositions, doesn't inadvertently draw back in those exact same extraneous variables since.
Which, honestly, brings us perfectly into this next phase of the text.
It really does flow right into it.
Because if we are actually going to dismantle how we understand the world, and that is what we're doing here, we have to start by, well, quietly dismantling how we think about thinking itself. We are moving past the cold, rigid rules of logic and those simple clinical data points of our five senses.
Right, leaving that sterile space behind.
Exactly. The author is inviting us to step into a much deeper, more vaguely felt reality. A reality of worth, of value, and of our incredibly intimate, almost overwhelming connection with the universe. I want you to just quiet your mind for a moment, let the noise of the day fall away, and prepare for what feels like a fundamental, subtle shift in how you perceive your very own existence.
It is a quietly profound shift. I mean, we are so deeply conditioned to revere deductive logic.
Oh, absolutely.
We're taught from childhood to treat it as this coercive, supreme force that governs reality, the ultimate arbiter of truth. But the book makes a rather bold, almost understated claim here. It says logic is actually entirely tentative. Tentative, which is a terrifying word for people who love certainty.
Right. It does not stand on its own absolute authority. Instead, it relies on what the text calls the self-evidence of civilized experience. It places philosophy on a pragmatic basis. And we should be careful here. It does not mean pragmatism in the narrow modern sense of just doing whatever makes a quick profit or solves an immediate problem.
Yeah, not the corporate definition of pragmatism.
Exactly. It is an appeal to the wide, accumulated, lived experience of civilization itself. Before we can even begin to understand reality, we really have to look closely at the tools we use to measure it and acknowledge where those tools inevitably break down.
And one of the most fascinating places the text points out that breakdown is in the illusion of the variable. Let's unpack this slowly because it is so fundamental to how we reason. In logic or in algebra, we use variables all the time.
Every single day.
The letters X, Y, Z, or even a specific name like Socrates in a classical philosophical syllogism. We build these massive, towering intellectual structures on the backs of these variables. We do.
Oh.
And the variable is, well, it's an incredibly ingenious human invention, but it is fundamentally flawed when you actually apply it to the flow of real life.
How so?
It tries to combine two entirely contradictory things. It takes the infinite vagueness of the word any and tries to smash it together with the rigid definiteness of a particular. Think about how an equation works. When we introduce x into a mathematical or logical argument, it starts off meaning any number or any entity.
Right, it's a placeholder.
But as the train of reasoning continues, step by step, there is this tacit, completely unspoken assumption that whenever x reappears, it means exactly, perfectly the same thing it meant at the beginning. It assumes that a symbol can retain its precise, unshifting identity throughout an entire argument, even as time passes and it enters into novel compositions.
But the text argues that complete self-identity can never actually be preserved as time advances into novelty. Nothing stays perfectly the same. The universe is a continuous humming process. The book gives this striking, almost haunting example to illustrate this. I want you to think of a baby lying in a cradle, and then think of that exact same person as a grown man in middle age. Are they identical?
In some dim, overarching societal sense, yes. We use the same name, we assign them the same legal identity, the same social security number, but in so many other profoundly real senses, they are entirely diverse.
They're completely different entities.
Right. The physical cells have died and been completely replaced multiple times over. The mind has been reshaped by decades of trauma, joy, education, and memory. The consciousness of the middle-aged man looking back at the cradle is fundamentally not the consciousness of the baby looking up from it.
It's a completely different vantage point.
So if we build a logical argument based on the strict identity of that individual over time, we have to ask a very quiet, unsettling question. Is our conclusion truly substantiated by their identity, or is it completely vitiated by their diversity? Logic alone simply cannot answer that.
Deduction fails us.
It does. It requires a deeper metaphysical understanding to support it because logic assumes a static world and we happen to live in a dynamic one.
I want to linger on that for a second Because if cold logic isn't the bedrock of our understanding, we usually fall back on our senses.
That's the usual safety net.
For centuries, modern epistemology, think of philosophers like Descartes and Hume. They tried to convince us that human experience is based purely on clear sensory data, what the text calls sensa. They argued that our baseline reality is just absorbing clear, distinct details. Seeing a patch of red, hearing a loud noise, feeling a square shape.
It is a remarkably sterile way to view human existence.
It really is.
The text mounts a deeply humbling critique of this idea that we are just passive receivers of clear data. Because if you truly strip away the emotional background, if you abstract our lives down to just a sequence of clear sensory inputs, the result is pure triviality.
There's an example in the book that paints this absurdity so perfectly. I want you to imagine that your experience is just a sequence of pure sensory data. First, you register a red and green pattern that is immediately followed by a blue and gray pattern, and the sequence closes with a clear bell-like sound.
Just isolated data points.
Exactly. If we are just biological machines absorbing sensory details, that sequence is the entirety of the experience, and yet it is utterly hopelessly meaningless. It reduces the immense, heavy richness of human life to an accidental slideshow of colors and noises.
Because it gets the relationship completely backwards. The text argues that we do not experience clear details and then somehow assemble them into a meaningful reaction. The details are actually a reaction to our totality.
That's a huge pivot.
It is. Think about the book's analogy of walking into a room. When you step across the threshold into a room, you do not function like a camera, objectively cataloging the exact color frequency of the upholstery or the geometric angles of the furniture.
I do struggle with that a bit, though, because if we aren't relying on those clear sensory details to understand the room, aren't we just relying on subjective imagination? I mean, how do we actually know the room is there?
It is a completely fair question. It's not that the sensory details do not exist, but rather that they are secondary to a much heavier prior feeling. You enter that room already brimming with an active aesthetic experience. You carry a mood, a history, a physiological state.
Like walking into a room after an argument.
Yes. You feel the atmosphere, the tension, or the comfort of the room before you ever consciously register the shape of the chairs. The vague, heavy totality of the experience comes first. The clarity of our senses, the specific shade of blue on the wall, the ticking of a clock, they merely add vividness and definition to a feeling you already possess.
So the senses just color in the lines of what we already feel.
Exactly. The sensory clarity is interpretive, not originative. The profound mistake of modern philosophy was assuming that because sensory data is definite and easy to talk about, it must be the foundation of reality. But the text insists that our emotions, our purposes, our vague apprehensions of the room, those are the true foundation.
And at the very base of that foundation, deeper than any specific emotion like joy or sadness, is what the book calls the sense of worth. And we need to be very careful with this word.
Yes, it's easily misunderstood.
This isn't worth in a praising eulogistic sense. It's not about deciding if a painting is good or bad or if a person is moral or immoral. It is the raw, quiet sense of existence for its own sake. The feeling that existence is its own justification.
It is the primitive realization that actuality has intrinsic value simply by virtue of existing. Before we ever analyze our surroundings, before we judge or discard details, our most primitive grasp of reality is a dim, vague division of the universe into a threefold scheme. The text defines these three parts as the whole, that other, and this myself.
Let's really chew on those three, because they are not sharp intellectual categorizations. They are feelings.
Deep feelings.
You have this myself, which is the immediate, undeniable feeling of your own egoistic value experience, the simple, heavy weight of your own being. Then there is that other, which is the dim realization that there are other centers of feeling, other entities asserting their own existence around you. And finally, the whole, the overwhelming unity that embraces and connects all of it. You feel the many which are one, and the one which includes the many.
And what is so striking is that this isn't just an abstract metaphysical concept meant to stay in a textbook. The text draws a direct line from this dim realization of worth to the very foundations of human society.
It grounds everything.
It argues that the basis of democracy and the entire conception of human morals rests on this shared fact of value experience. Every single pulsation of actuality, every moment of existence, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, has value for itself, for others, and for the whole.
Because reality is constituted by this character of upholding value, we have absolutely no right to deface it. The universe is, in its essence, the upholding of value intensity. No unit can fully separate itself from the others or from the whole, yet each unit exists in its own right, demanding to be recognized as something that matters.
It is a deeply humbling perspective, especially when we consider how arrogant we can be about our own human perception. The text points out that if excellence were truly just about the clarity of sensory experience, human beings would be entirely unimpressive.
We really would be.
Yeah.
The book literally calls us amateurs in sense experience.
Amateurs.
We pride ourselves on our intellect. But a hound's sense of smell operates on a level of clarity we cannot even fathom. An eagle's sight vastly outpaces our own. Is direct, vivid sensory clarity were the absolute pinnacle of existence, we would be sitting near the bottom of the animal kingdom. Our excellence doesn't come from being the best biological cameras or microphones. It comes from how those sensory abstractions illustrate and stimulate the infinite variety of reality for us.
Which brings us to perhaps one of the most subtle yet profound questions the text asks. Where does your body actually end?
That is such a haunting question.
We take our association with our bodies completely for granted. We assume a firm boundary between me and the external world. Skin is the border wall.
But the book dismantles that boundary so gently. I want you, listening right now, to think about a physical object you might be holding. Maybe a pen. The pen is external nature. Your hand gripping it is your body. Your fingernails pressing into the plastic are your body. But where is the absolute definitive line?
You can't find it.
The text brings up the breath passing in and out of your lungs. Take a slow breath right now. Feel the air flowing through your mouth and down your throat. At what exact millisecond does the air of the room cease to be the external world and suddenly become you?
You cannot find that millisecond because it does not exist. It fluctuates. It is a continuous, unbroken exchange. The body is only very vaguely distinguishable from external nature. It is merely one natural object among others, temporarily organized in a specific way. And what is endlessly fascinating is the invisible nature of the healthy body.
Oh, this part is brilliant.
The book highlights that the internal functioning of a healthy body provides singularly few clear sense data.
It is true. When our body finally does give us loud, clear sensory signals, they are mostly aches and pains, and we immediately send for a doctor. We mostly only feel our body when something is wrong with it. Furthermore, we see with our eyes, we do not see our eyes.
We don't walk into a room and say, well, here I am, and I have brought my body with me. The body is simply that portion of nature with which we most intimately cooperate in every passing moment. There is a constant inflow and outflow between human experience and bodily actuality. We are not isolated ghosts driving meat machines. We are a continuous breathing part of the fabric of nature.
And that fabric is composed of what the text calls power. But we have to completely discard the Newtonian idea of power as mere physical force.
Right, forget the billiard balls.
Exactly, the idea of pushing passive matter around. In this text, actuality is composed of three things: totality, externality, and internality. We've touched on these: the whole, the other, and the self. And the text defines power as the compulsion of composition.
Yes, the compulsion of composition. It is the drive in the universe toward aesthetic worth for its own sake.
Let me stop you there, because compulsion of composition is an incredibly dense phrase. Can you give us a real-world analogy to help ground what the author means by this?
Think of a symphony. A single note played on a violin has a certain physical reality, right? A sound wave. But when that note is played alongside a cello, a flute, and a timpani, there is a compulsion for those individual elements to compose together into something greater, something with profound aesthetic depth.
They want to merge.
Exactly. They are driven to form a chord, a melody, a movement. The universe, according to this text, is not just a random scattering of atoms bumping into each other in the void. It is driven by this very compulsion. Elements are compelled to compose together to create value, to create something that matters. That drive toward aesthetic worth is what the book means by power.
To really grasp the weight of that, we need to picture the scenario the book gives us. I want you to imagine an isolated glade deep within a primeval forest. And in that hidden darkness, surrounded by ancient trees, a single, incredibly subtle flower blooms. It possesses a complex, staggering beauty. But no human will ever walk past it. No animal passing by has the subtlety of experience to fully comprehend or enjoy its aesthetic depth.
To a purely utilitarian mindset or a purely scientific mindset that relies entirely on observation, that flowers' beauty is wasted, or perhaps doesn't even functionally matter. But the text insists that this unseen beauty exists as a grand fact in the universe.
It matters just by being.
Yes. The individual microscopic cells of the flower cannot comprehend their total effect. and the passing animals cannot grasp it. But the value of those details for the totality of the historic fact is immense. It matters that the flower is beautiful simply because the universe is enriched by that composition.
Realizing the immense inherent value of these unseen details to the totality of the universe, that is what the book identifies as the intuition of holiness, the sacred.
Yes, it is the foundation of all religion, stripped entirely of dogma. It is the raw intuition that there is an absoluteness in the nature of things, that aesthetic significance stretches far beyond the finite immediacy of anyone experiencing it. It is a sense of power and history that drives process towards some ideal, even if that ideal is never perfectly witnessed.
And those ideals, even when they are entirely unrealized, hold tremendous power over reality. The text uses the example of the American Constitution. It dimly outlines these grand ideals of liberty, activity, and cooperation. Have those ideals ever been perfectly realized in practice?
Of course not.
They are beyond perfect realization. They are limited by the messy, constrained nature of humanity. But that does not mean they are powerless abstractions.
Far from it. The text argues that the very energy of idealization, the immanence of that drive toward an ideal, is exactly what transforms bare process into glowing history. The ideal molds the form of what is realized. The fact that the ideal exists compels the composition of society toward it, even if it never reaches perfection. It acts as a magnetic pull, pulling actuality forward into the future.
But to be pulled forward, to truly engage with reality, we have to stop hiding behind cold abstractions. There's a quiet moment in the text where it asks you to imagine simply saying, I see a blue stain out there. On the surface, it sounds like the most simple, objective, unarguable statement possible.
But the book warns us that it is a massive abstraction. By isolating just the quality of blue, we are ignoring an infinitely complex reality happening beneath the surface. We ignore the intricate flux of light waves, the biological reactions within the retina, the transmission of signals to the brain. We abstract all of that away to just say blue.
It's a shorthand that makes us blind to reality.
And more importantly, the text points out that we do not physically interact with the concept of blue.
Right, you don't reach out and touch blueness. You stretch out your arm to interact with a physical object. You reach out to touch a blue cup because you are thirsty. Or you step away from a blue flame because you know it will burn you. You act to preserve or to modify the relationships in your physical environment. We are physically engaging with reality, not just contemplating it from a sterile distance.
Which brings us to the ultimate rejection of cold, detached philosophy in this section of the text. Because we are always engaging with reality, there is no such independent item in actuality as a mere concept.
None. Every single concept, every thought that passes through your mind is inextricably clothed in emotion. You cannot hold a purely neutral thought. Every concept is wrapped in hope or fear or hatred or eager aspiration or even just the quiet pleasure of analysis. The variations of appetition are infinite, but the emotion is always undeniably there.
So we find ourselves having traversed a vast, quiet landscape. We began by watching the failure of cold, deductive logic to fully capture the changing identity of human life from the cradle to old age. We stripped away the illusion that we are just biological cameras reacting to clear sensory data, recognizing instead that our vague, heavy feelings of worth and totality come first. We saw our very physical boundaries blur, feeling our breath fluctuate between the self and the external world, gently dissolving the arrogant lines we draw between our bodies and nature.
And we ended in the deep woods, recognizing the sacred, inherent value of an unseen flower, and understanding that every thought we have ever had about this universe is dressed in emotion. If our physical boundaries are truly that fluid, and if every thought we hold is actually an emotion disguised as logic, it begs a quiet question. When we feel so deeply isolated or disconnected in our modern lives, are we actually alone, or have we just temporarily forgotten how to feel the parts of ourselves that extend endlessly beyond our own skin?
Because as we hold on to that thought, it naturally pulls us deeper into the next layer of how this aesthetic reality silently shapes our future. We are stepping directly into the quiet, profound architecture of Alfred Whitehead's modes of thought. Within this book, we have reached a critical threshold, passing seamlessly from the concluding reflections on the civilized universe right into the deeply analytical lecture titled Nature Lifeless.
Yes, and what we are navigating here is not merely a history of scientific paradigms. We're examining the invisible foundational structures of human consciousness itself. We are looking at how human beings abstract reality simply to survive within it.
Exactly. And how the scientific frameworks we have inherited have systematically stripped nature of its vitality. We have been left with a cold, mechanical illusion, a conceptual framework that modern physics is really only now beginning to dismantle.
To understand the origin of this illusion, we have to look at the mechanism of thought itself. Whitehead points a rather sharp finger at the philosopher David Hume, suggesting Hume made a fundamental error regarding how we perceive reality.
Right, what exactly is Whitehead critiquing there? Because Hume's influence is so pervasive.
The critique centers on a radical oversimplification of human experience. Hume conceived of human perception as a series of initial, bare sense impressions. He imagined these impressions as, I suppose you could call them, isolated drops of sensory data.
Like a patch of red or a sharp sound.
Precisely. A sudden scent falling upon the mind, completely devoid of any essential emotional relationship to the rest of the universe. Hume effectively severed the connective tissue of reality.
By treating those sensory moments as self-contained facts, he ignored the emotional derivation, the felt reality from which those impressions actually emerge. We do not experience the world as a sterile ticker tape of data.
No, we experience a deeply interconnected, emotionally resonant whole. Hume's mistake was confusing the final, refined product of conscious attention with the raw, chaotic foundation of actual experience.
Which brings us to a concept that Whitehead treats with granular precision, and that is the blade of abstraction. If Hume's error was treating isolated fragments as the whole truth, it seems abstraction is the process by which we create those fragments in the first place.
It is. But Whitehead doesn't frame abstraction purely as a human flaw. He positions it as a defining characteristic that separates the very tiers of existence.
Right, so does a microscopic organism, say a living germ, abstract reality in the same way a human does?
It is a matter of scale and complexity, but the fundamental mechanism is absolutely present. A living germ is distinguished from the lifeless physical activities swirling around it strictly by the abstractions inherent in its own microscopic existence.
It reacts to specific chemical gradients or temperatures?
While completely ignoring the vast cosmic radiation or the distant gravitational pull of the moon, it abstracts what is necessary for its survival from the infinite totality of its environment.
And as we move up the chain of being, higher animals utilize abstractions in a far more distinct manner. A predator abstracts the scent of its prey from the complex tapestry of the forest. It selects a detail to hunt, to flee, to survive.
Mankind, however, is defined by an extreme, almost overwhelming emphasis on this process. In Whitehead's view within the book, the very growth of human consciousness is synonymous with the uprise of abstractions. Consciousness is fundamentally the growth of emphasis.
It is a mechanism of survival, essentially. I think of it like taking a massive, overwhelmingly complex photograph of a bustling city street. If you try to absorb every single face, every brick, every shadow, and every reflection simultaneously, your mind would simply collapse under the weight of the information.
So you crop the image.
Exactly. You cut away the periphery and focus intensely on one single detail in the center, perhaps a traffic light changing from red to green. By doing that, you can understand it, you can interact with it, you can safely cross the street. That selection claims your attention and evokes a vital energy of self-realization.
That is the fortunate upward evolution of abstraction. It stirs the depths of experience and allows for finite conscious discrimination. But Whitehead issues a severe, almost melancholic warning regarding its dual nature.
The danger of it.
Yes. The degeneracy of mankind begins precisely when we fall victim to what he calls chill abstractions. This occurs when an abstraction is violently divorced from its aesthetic content, severed from the concrete sense of value from which it was initially drawn.
When an abstraction loses its connection to the living whole, it devolves into a mere flicker of interest that actively destroys its own massive basis for survival.
We see the consequences of chill abstractions everywhere in modern society. It happens when an economic system reduces a lush, ancient, living forest entirely to a calculus of board feet and timber yield, ignoring the ecological web, the oxygen production, the sheer aesthetic majesty of the space.
Or when a human being is reduced merely to a statistic of labor or a data point for a marketing algorithm. The abstraction separates from the totality, and in doing so, it becomes destructive. But the human mind is not entirely defenseless against this fragmentation, is it? Whitehead describes an internal preservative instinct.
Yes, he calls it rationalization. And rationalization, in Whitehead's specific philosophical context, operates as the reverse of abstraction. It is the conscious mind's desperate, instinctual attempt to stitch the torn world back together.
When you first experience the world, you fix your attention on a sensory detail, a specific color, a sharp sound. You have abstracted it, but immediately, instinctively, your mind glances around.
You attempt to lift that isolated detail back into a meaningful unit. You try to perceive the whole building, the living animal, the mountain. Rationalization is a partial fulfillment of the ideal to recover the concrete reality from within the severe disjunction that abstraction forces upon us.
We tear the world apart to understand it, and we spend our conscious lives trying to weave it back into a tapestry. And this intrinsic struggle to capture the precise details of the universe leads directly to the core of nature lifeless.
Whitehead notes that philosophy is the product of wonder, the romance of human thought. We constantly inherit traditional doctrines, and we easily detect the superstitions of past ages, yet we remain curiously uncertain about the formulation of any true detail of our own knowledge.
To understand the specific crisis of modern thought, we really have to examine the historical paradigm formed in the 16th and 17th centuries. This is the formation of the common sense notion of the universe. It requires us to picture the universe as an infinite, entirely empty warehouse.
Within that empty space, this paradigm posits the existence of passive, enduring bits of matter. Think of chairs, rocks, planets, or animal bodies. According to this 17th century view, these bits of matter possess what Whitehead terms private qualifications.
They have a specific shape, a mass, a specific motion, and they endure self-identically through time.
And ruling over this cold warehouse is geometry. Geometry was conceived as the absolute, unchanging science of spatial relationships. Space itself was seen as eternal and homogeneous from infinity to infinity, acting simply as the passive receptacle for these bits of matter.
Locomotion was nothing more than a change in spatial relationship. Matter was a passive fact. It was a fundamentally self-sufficient, meaningless complex of facts.
Which brings us to the grand, haunting paradox of our time. This 17th century common sense notion, this billiard ball universe of isolated matter moving through an empty void, has been utterly and completely destroyed by the discoveries of modern science.
Not a single feature of it remains valid as a fundamental description of physical reality. Yet it stubbornly rules our daily lives. If two neighbors go to a modern law court to settle a dispute over a property line, the entire legal framework implicitly relies on Newton's dead universe.
It truly does. The law treats the soil, the wooden fence, and the surveyor's lines as enduring, isolated bits of matter locked in a static geometric grid. It dominates the marketplace. It shapes our everyday language.
It is the foundational assumption in nearly all the humanistic sciences. And the consequence of this paradox is a deeply tragic patchwork procedure in modern academia and thought.
Because the old common sense notion survives alongside modern scientific revelations, our intellectual world is fractured. Whitehead points out a glaring example in the book Biology, secretly presupposing the outdated physics of 40 years prior.
You have physiologists attempting to study complex, dynamic living organisms while unconsciously holding on to a physical model of passive, isolated matter that quantum physicists have long since abandoned.
This departmentalization trivializes the mentality of the scientific profession. It is a profound crisis because our fundamental branches of knowledge do not even agree on what reality fundamentally is.
You cannot adequately explain fluid, dynamic life using a conceptual framework built out of dead, static blocks. It creates a complete muddle in philosophic cosmology.
Let us trace exactly how that specific muddle was created. How did science systematically strip the world of its meaning, leaving us with this dead nature?
The text points to the exile of the secondary qualities. In the development and the transmission theories for light and sound, scientists made a monumental philosophical decision. They decided that color, sound, and scent did not actually exist out there in the physical world.
The profound redness of a rose, the sharp scent of pine, the comforting warmth of a fire, these were relegated to mere mental reactions occurring entirely inside the dark theater of the human brain. Nature itself was left as a dark, silent void of bare matter.
The loss of these secondary qualities was a severe, almost violent restriction of reality. Nature was reduced to a mere agent of excitement, blindly provoking sensory reactions in the percipient.
This leaves us with a deeply artificial understanding of sense perception. When you look at a red rose, under this paradigm, you are artificially associating your mental enjoyment of the color red with a spatial region derived from a completely different source.
This artificiality brings Whitehead back to Hume's grand, irrefutable discovery. Pure sense perception is highly delusive and superficial.
It is an illusion we walk through every single day, often without noticing. If you look up at the night sky, you are perceiving the bright light of stars that may have vanished millions of years ago.
Your brain is manufacturing a present-tense experience out of incredibly ancient data. Or consider the feeling of looking into a mirror. You perceive a deep physical space behind the glass. You can see the angles and the lighting of a room that simply does not exist.
It is a localized hallucination created by light refraction, yet your senses report it as solid reality. Pure sense perception is a liar, and more importantly, as Hume discovered, sense perception provides absolutely no data for its own interpretation.
It gives us the raw, chaotic imagery, but no inherent meaning or reason. And into this immense philosophical void stepped Isaac Newton.
Newton provided the monumental synthesis that ruled science for over 2 centuries. He gave humanity the laws of motion and the grand law of gravitation. He provided a magnificent skeleton framework to organize the motions of the entire universe.
But in doing so, he left the universe entirely devoid of intrinsic meaning or value. A dead nature, Whitehead asserts, can give no reasons. It aims at nothing.
Newton introduced stresses like the invisible, relentless pull of gravity acting between these passive bodies of matter, but he gave absolutely no philosophical reason for why these stresses should exist in a dead universe.
Right. If the universe is just a cold warehouse of isolated, meaningless bits of matter, why should those bits exert any pull on one another? Why should a rock care about the gravitational presence of the Earth?
Newton's system left mass and stress as detached, arbitrary facts. There was no aim at value, no intrinsic reason for their existence. This lack of a why created the ultimate philosophical crisis, what Whitehead terms the Hume-Newton situation.
The Hume-Newton situation is the bedrock of the modern intellectual crisis. On one side, we were left with Hume's barren concept of a field of perception entirely devoid of any data for its own interpretation.
On the other side, we had Newton's mathematical system of interpretation, entirely devoid of any intrinsic reason. Immanuel Kant attempted to synthesize this impossible situation.
Kant essentially argued that because the universe is fundamentally chaotic and unintelligible, the human mind imposes its own structural categories like space, time, and causality onto the raw sensor data just to make sense of it.
But Whitehead vehemently views this foundational modern worldview as a profound reductio ad absurdum. It reduces modern physics to a sort of mystic chant over an incomprehensible void.
If we accept the Hume-Newton situation, we are essentially no different than ancient Babylonian astrologers dictating agricultural practices based on the mystic, unexplainable movements of stars. We are predicting outcomes based on rules we cannot philosophically justify.
It omits our deepest, most intuitive modes of understanding. But as we transition from the 19th century into the modern era, a quiet, earth-shattering revolution takes place in physics.
Interestingly, scientists initially resisted letting go of the old common sense notion. As they discovered the transmission of light and energy through seemingly empty space, they invented the ether theory.
The ether theory was a brilliant, desperate attempt to keep the old idea of solid, ordinary matter alive. Scientists tried to imagine all of seemingly empty space filled with a subtle, invisible, jelly-like substance.
This ether was granted the properties of continuity, cohesion, and inertia. The scientific mind of the 19th century was terrified of abandoning the mechanical universe, so they imagined ordinary matter merely as knots or entanglements within this cosmic jelly.
It was a way to maintain the illusion that there was still a passive, enduring substance underlying reality.
It is like trying to hold on to the edge of the pool because you're terrified of swimming in the deep end. But the true modern scientific revolution could not be held back by the comforting illusion of the ether.
The continuous, rigorous effort to understand the physical world eventually eliminated both empty space and the concept of isolated matter entirely. The physics of the present day reveals something far more profound. Matter is merely energy.
It is sheer activity. The passive substratum of self-identical, enduring bits of matter has been completely abandoned. What we historically called matter is, in reality, vibratory differentiations of space-time.
To grasp what a vibratory differentiation means, we really have to discard that warehouse analogy entirely. Think instead of the universe as an infinite taut spiderweb or a vast, dynamic ocean.
A knot in the web, or a wave on the ocean, is not a separate, isolated piece of matter that has been dropped into the environment. It is a localized vibration of the web or the water itself.
Because the entire spatial universe is a continuous field of force, a field of incessant activity, any local agitation shakes the whole universe. The old concept of simple location, the comforting practical idea that a thing can exist completely independently, self-contained within one localized, walled-off region of space, is entirely deconstructed.
If you move your hand right now, The atmospheric, gravitational, and energetic displacement may be infinitesimally minute by the time it reaches the outer atmosphere, but those effects are absolutely real. They ripple out to the farthest star clusters.
There is no possibility of a detached, self-contained existence anywhere in nature. The environment constantly, relentlessly seeps into the nature of the object, and the object endlessly extends its character into the environment.
Whitehead provides a crucial example from biology to illustrate the widespread failure to grasp this interconnectedness. He points to geneticists who mistakenly conceive of genes as isolated, self-identical pellets of matter.
Yes, if you view genes as tiny, independent dictators of heredity, you are falling back into the 17th century warehouse. You are treating heredity as a mechanical sorting of static beads.
This view completely ignores how the surrounding animal body, the living dynamic environment, actually modifies, suppresses, or activates those genes.
A gene is not a static particle. It is a localized pattern of activity functioning within a much larger, infinitely complex dynamic system.
Yeah.
It is in constant dialogue with the chemistry of the cell, the stress of the organism, and the wider environment.
And because of this profound interconnectedness, the old space-time model is definitively dead. Space is no longer a passive geometric substratum, an empty stage waiting for actors to walk across it.
Nature is an active, undivided theater of interrelated activities. All things change. Both the activities themselves and their interrelations are in constant fluid flux.
We can no longer study what the Aristotelians called the procession of forms, which is the observation of static, unchanging objects simply moving along a timeline. We are compelled now to study the forms of process. We are studying the internal relations within a massive, complex state of pure activity.
The philosophical weight of this realization changes everything about how we perceive reality. We have witnessed the total collapse of the lifeless mechanical universe.
The cold warehouse of isolated parts, ruled by arbitrary geometry, has vanished. In its place, we find a living, deeply interconnected web of endless process and activity. Everything touches everything else.
Every division we make, every boundary we draw, whether it is a property line on a map, the skin of an organism, or even the scientific abstraction of half a wave, is merely a tool of human convenience.
It is a necessary abstraction for survival, but it is not the ultimate truth. These abstractions artificially sever the true underlying patterns of process that extend infinitely beyond all our constructed borders.
It leaves you with a quiet, immensely provocative realization about your own existence. If the universe operates not as a collection of isolated matter, but as a vast field of intertwined activity, then how does that redefine our understanding of our own physical and mental boundaries?
You are not an isolated piece of matter moving through a dark void. You are a localized pattern of activity shaped by and continuously extending into the entire universe around you. Your very consciousness, your ability to abstract and rationalize, is a vibratory differentiation of this infinite web. With this deep understanding of the forms of process established and the mechanical illusion firmly dismantled, we are now stepping directly into the next phase of Whitehead's philosophy.
You find yourself sitting quietly, perhaps looking out a window, or just resting your eyes, feeling the steady, unbroken passage of time. And as you let the noise of the day fade away, we are stepping right back into the current of our ongoing contemplation. We're moving gracefully forward through the intricate ideas within the book Modes of Thought by Alfred Whitehead. Right now, our focus is lingering on a profound, almost unsettling transition in human understanding. We are stepping away from the comfortable, familiar illusion of a lifeless, static nature, and we're crossing the threshold into the reality of a living, active, breathing universe. Our mission in this quiet space is to calmly explore just how deep the illusion of a static universe runs, and to completely unpack this beautiful, complex definition of life, seamlessly continuing our philosophical journey.
To truly grasp that living nature, we first have to confront how our own innate perspective fundamentally deceives us. It begins with our perception of scale, specifically the time spans we unconsciously use to judge the universe. Whitehead identifies a deep habit in human thought. We take the observable functioning of our own human bodies as the absolute standard for everything. We instinctively measure reality by, the rhythm of our own heartbeat, the length of a single breath, or the span of our waking consciousness.
Which feels incredibly narrow when you pull back and look at the whole picture. I mean, if you look at a mountain or even just a stone resting on the ground, you don't see any change over the course of a single second. But the absence of change in that tiny human-sized window tells us absolutely nothing about the internal changes that might occur over 1,000 years.
And that logic extends infinitely outward. If you observe no apparent change within 1,000 years, that gives you zero information about what happens over 1,000,000 years. And no change in 1,000,000 years tells us nothing about 1,000,000,000 years. There is simply no absolute standard of magnitude in the physical universe. Any time span you choose to imagine is impossibly large compared to the one before it, and infinitesimally small compared to the one after it. Yet we have built entire scientific paradigms on the flawed premise that our human scale of observation is the ultimate baseline of reality.
So if our baseline is flawed, how does that warp the way we categorize the things around us?
Yeah.
Because science naturally tries to group things together. We observe activities, colors, values, and we try to sort them. We look at a leaf and say this is green, or we look at a forest and say all those things are green. It seems harmless enough.
It seems harmless, yes, but Whitehead views it as a historical trap. Making those basic categorizations, saying this is green, or in formal terms, some subject is this predicate, is the absolute foundation of traditional Aristotelian logic. Now, undeniably, making those basic categorizations is a necessary first step if you want to understand anything. You have to start by naming the parts. But the issue is that for over 2,000 years, philosophical and scientific thought has been so deeply dominated by this Aristotelian background that it has essentially paralyzed our broader understanding.
It's almost like trying to understand the entire internet, but only categorizing websites by their background color. Yes, technically you can group 1,000,000 websites together and say these are blue, but you are completely missing the reality that one is a bank, one is a shoe store, and one is a personal blog. You've categorized them, but you haven't understood them.
That is a very apt way to look at it. The text refers to this obsessive itch to reduce the complex, vibrant universe into rigid, simple forms as the disease of philosophy. Every special scientific discipline tries to move beyond that initial stage of just naming and categorizing. But whenever thinkers try to combine those specialized sciences into a comprehensive philosophy, a cosmology that gives us a real, functioning understanding of the whole universe, they unconsciously relapse into those rigid Aristotelian forms. They get stuck in the boxes they built.
If categorizing is where we get stuck in stage 2, stage 3 of scientific development is where we try to find quantitative decisions. We move from asking, what color is this, to asking, how much of it is there? We introduce numbers, quantity, and measurement. But numbers alone can't possibly describe reality either, can they?
They cannot. A simple-minded trust in numbers and quantitative measurement can be just as misleading as our undue trust in basic logic. This brings us to a crucial fourth stage of understanding, which is the notion of pattern. Unless we pay deep, careful attention to the concept of pattern, our understanding of nature remains incredibly crude.
So if counting the parts doesn't give us the whole picture, what exactly are we missing? It feels like having all the ingredients on a kitchen counter but having no idea what you're actually about to bake.
The analogy Whitehead uses involves chemistry, and it perfectly illustrates your point. Imagine you have a closed container filled with carbon atoms and oxygen atoms. You know the exact mathematical quantity of each, you've counted them perfectly, but simply knowing the quantity tells you absolutely nothing about the actual properties of the substance inside that container.
Because you don't know how they are arranged.
Precisely. The properties remain a complete mystery until the question of pattern is settled. Are those atoms just drifting around as free oxygen and free carbon? Or have they formed a pattern to become carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide? The quantitative amounts of carbon and oxygen might be exactly the same in two different scenarios, but the pattern they form dictates the entire reality of the substance. And it goes even deeper than chemical bonds. You also have to consider regional patterns, how those substances are physically distributed within the container. Are they separated into distinct layers? Are they swirling together in a chaotic storm?
So the way things exist together is what actually defines them. Quantity is effectively meaningless without a presupposed pattern.
Yes. Beyond all questions of quantity lie the fundamental questions of pattern. Different modes of togetherness define the universe. Quantity itself is really nothing more than a way of describing analogous functions within those larger patterns.
It really makes you realize how deeply we rely on unconscious assumptions. When we ask a question about the physical world, we're usually assuming the types of entities involved, we're assuming their modes of togetherness, and we are assuming widely spread generalities of pattern. We just take them for granted as the backdrop of reality.
And those all-pervading patterns of behavior, the ones we just implicitly assume are always operating, are what we casually refer to as the laws of nature. We focus our intense scientific attention on the tiny, localized details of measurement, while the massive, shifting patterns of the wider universe lie completely outside our focus.
This highlights the deep danger of abstraction. Every specialized science, by its very definition, relies on abstraction. To study a very narrow specific field, say cellular biology or particle physics, you have to intentionally omit an overwhelming number of factors from the vast, complex universe just to clear your workspace.
The danger arises when you forget that you made that omission. Every abstraction neglects the influx of the omitted universe. A single pattern, when observed through the limited, highly focused lens of a special science, is actually just a subordinate factor inside an indefinite number of wider, overlapping patterns. Even within one specific scientific field, you will eventually find things functioning in diverse ways that simply cannot be explained by the isolated rules of that specific science. They can only be understood when you finally look at the wider relationships of the universe you previously ignored.
This feels like a direct challenge to the way modern science often operates. There is a tendency for leaders in the natural sciences to fiercely defend the absolute autonomy of their specific fields. They act as if their isolated slice of reality contains all the answers. The text characterizes this belief in absolute scientific autonomy as a touching example of baseless faith.
It is a baseless faith because they are clinging to a concept of absolute autonomy that actually originates from a completely discarded, antiquated view of the world. They are unknowingly relying on the ghost of an old philosophy to justify their modern isolation.
If we peel away all these abstractions and discarded philosophies, what are the primary realities of the universe? If nature isn't just a static collection of measurable objects, but rather a constant flow of activities and processes that arise and pass away, what is actually happening out there?
Nature cannot be reduced to the formulas of a multiplication table. As another great philosopher once noted, nature is not a bloodless dance of categories. Nature is full-blooded. Real, vibrating facts are actively occurring in every moment. Physical nature, as studied by science, is really just a map of the more stable, repetitive interrelations between those real, vibrating facts.
To really see that full-blooded nature, we have to completely dismantle the old Newtonian view of the world. For about 4 centuries, from the 16th century onward, science focused almost entirely on space and matter. It allowed scientists to conceive of the full reality of nature at a completely frozen instant, completely divorced from the flow of time.
That frozen instant is the absolute core of the Newtonian and Cartesian cosmology. Newton viewed reality as matter occupying space at a durationless instant. Imagine taking a photograph of a car racing at 100 miles an hour. In that single frozen snapshot, the car has no speed. It occupies a specific space, but nothing is moving. Newton believed that everything that mattered about reality was captured in that frozen slice of time. Change and endurance were treated as merely accidental. Nature at a specific instant was considered equally real whether or not there was any past or future.
Descartes agreed with this, arguing that endurance was just a perpetual recreation of matter at each independent instant. But there is a massive, fatal contradiction in this frozen view. If reality only exists in a durationless instant, then concepts like velocity and momentum become completely meaningless.
Because velocity and momentum inherently require a connection to what just happened and what is about to happen. They require the concept that the state of things at other times and other places actively enters into the essential character of the matter right now. But the frozen Newtonian snapshot allows for no such connection. It leaves physics relying on essential concepts of motion that completely contradict its own foundation of a frozen universe.
But didn't mathematicians figure out a workaround for this? Doesn't calculus deal with things happening at an instant? I'm thinking of the mathematical concept of a limit.
Calculus is a brilliant mathematical tool, but mathematical subtleties cannot save a flawed cosmology. The Newtonian notion of occupying space corresponds to the bare value of a mathematical function at a single selected point. But to calculate velocity, Newtonian physics has to use the limit of the function at that point. A mathematical limit inherently references the behavior of the function at other times and places surrounding that point. There is absolutely no philosophical reason within a completely frozen, durationless universe why the bare value at a single point should suddenly reference the past and the future.
So at a genuinely frozen instant, there is actually nothing. An instant is merely a human mental tool for grouping matters of fact. Nature simply cannot exist without transition, and it cannot exist without the temporal duration of time. Everything that is real is implicated in the creative advance of time.
Which leads us directly into the concept of nature alive. If bare frozen activity without duration is nothing, we have to look for the underlying reason behind the transition. Why does one moment flow into the next? Here we confront the profound weakness of popular positivistic philosophy. Positivism is content to merely accept the routine formulas of physics without seeking any deeper underlying reasons. It looks at the universe and simply says, this event follows that event, and accepts that ultimate irrationality.
The text uses a wonderful analogy about our ancient ancestors to show how limiting this positivist view is. Imagine if early humans, 100,000 years ago, had been strict positivists. They would have observed the world without searching for any underlying connections. If they saw insects visiting flowers, a consistent positivist would just log the observation. Insects visit flowers. That is a fact of charming simplicity, and they would never ask why.
But our ancestors intuitively sensed a deeper connection. They sensed a reasonable congruity between the natures of insects and the natures of flowers, and they extended their observation to figure out why they interacted. That relentless search for deeper connection and reason is the entire basis of human civilization. Yet, modern science often suffers from a muddle-headed positivism that insists the sheer, observable physical routines are all there is, and nothing deeper exists.
And that modern insistence comes straight from the disastrous dualism introduced by Descartes. He drew a sharp, poisonous division between material substances, which have physical mass and spatial relations, and mental substances, which exist entirely externally to the material world.
Descartes claimed that neither type of substance required the other for its existence. He basically sliced the universe in half. On one side, you have physical stuff, rocks, tables, human bodies. On the other side, you have the mind, thoughts, feelings, purposes. He claimed they operate completely independently.
But if you've ever gotten a severe stomachache simply because you are incredibly nervous about a public speaking event, you intuitively know the division is completely false. Your mental state directly altered your physical reality. Furthermore, this sharp division completely ignores the vast middle ground of life, vegetation, single cells, basic animal life, which touch upon human mentality at their highest points and basic inorganic chemistry at their lowest.
That sharp Cartesian division between nature and life forces modern thinkers into two absurd extreme corners. Either you have to believe that physical nature is just an illusion and the mind is the only reality, or you have to believe that physical nature is the sole reality and the mind is merely an epiphenomenon, a trivial, useless byproduct of brain chemistry that has no real impact on the world. Whitehead insists we must reject this depressing dualism entirely. We have to fuse physical nature and life together as intertwined, essential factors composing the reality of the universe.
Okay, so if we tear down the idea of a lifeless frozen universe, and we reject the idea that the mind is just a useless byproduct, what is Whitehead's alternative? How does he actually define life? He breaks it down into three fundamental characteristics, starting with a phrase that sounds quite unusual: absolute self-enjoyment.
It does sound unusual. Life implies an immediate internal individuality. Whitehead describes this as a complex process of appropriating data from the surrounding physical processes of nature and weaving them into a unified existence. He calls this process prehension, or an occasion of experience. Even a single living cell absorbs nutrients and reacts to its environment, unifying that data into its own immediate existence. That occasion of experience is absolute in its immediate self-enjoyment. It is an internal process of being.
Self-enjoyment almost sounds like a spa day, but it's really about the profound, unified experience of existing in a specific moment. But existing in the moment isn't enough to define life. The second characteristic is creative activity.
The universe is never static. Creative activity is the continuous process of eliciting factors in the universe that previously existed only as unrealized potential and forcing them into actual being. The process of self-creation is the transformation of what could be into what is, and that transformation inherently includes that immediacy of self-enjoyment. The universe is forever plunging forward into the creative advance.
Which brings us to the third and perhaps most vital characteristic of life:
Aim. Aim is the direction of that creative process. At any given moment, there is a boundless wealth of alternative potentials for what could happen next. Aim is the active exclusion of most of those potentials in order to select and actualize one definite factor of novelty. It involves entertaining ideal possibilities in order to guide the creative unification of the next moment. So, a living entity is defined by its internal self-enjoyment, its creative activity in the present, and its aim toward a specific future.
But when we look at the methodology of modern science, it seems utterly blind to all three of these characteristics. Science looks at nature and finds no internal enjoyment, no creativity, and no aim. And the argument here is that this blindness stems from our heavy reliance on our sense perception, specifically our sense of sight.
Sense perception always has a dual character. There's the external reference to the object we are looking at, and the internal bodily reference, the physical fact that our eyes and brain are doing the work of seeing. When we look at something, the external reference completely dominates our attention, and the bodily reference fades into the background. Many philosophical doctrines deeply neglect this bodily reference, trusting only the external image.
There is an analogy of a paving stone that exposes this flaw perfectly. Pragmatically, to our external sense of sight and touch, a paving stone on the street is a hard, solid, static, unmoving fact.
But physical science itself reveals that this external perception is incredibly superficial. Beneath the surface, the paving stone is a localized storm of intense, vibrating molecular activity. Our naked sense perception omits any awareness of the fundamental, vibrant activities actually occurring within nature.
And yet science often fails to endow its own discoveries of molecular activity with any deeper meaning. It maps out the massive general physical laws of inorganic nature, which are really just widespread habits that dominate at our specific macroscopic scale of observation. To a science proceeding with massive impersonal impetus, there appears to be no aim in nature at all.
But if you contrast that scientific blindness with everyday human reality, aim is everywhere. Consider a criminal trial. Proving a motive, which is entirely a mental aim, a purpose for acting, is central to the prosecution. No defense lawyer would ever argue that a mental purpose cannot direct bodily motions, or that indicting a thief is as irrational as indicting the sun for rising.
Or think of a statesman navigating international relations. They constantly have to estimate the different types of patriotism prevalent in different nations. Patriotism is a collective mental aim. Even if you just watch a lost dog sniffing the air, frantically trying to find its master, you're clearly seeing a mental purpose directing physical bodily action. Mental operations and purposes are undeniably active factors directing the physical course of nature. Mentality is part of nature.
Recognizing this allows us to see the vast, unbroken continuity of nature. There are 6 rough types of occurrences in the universe. First, human existence with complex body and mind. Second, animal life. Third, vegetable life. Fourth, single living cells. Fifth, large-scale inorganic aggregates like stones or planets. And sixth, the infinitesimal happenings in modern particle physics.
And the most crucial realization is that there are no sharp cuts between any of these categories. They continuously shade off into each other depending on how closely you look.
Animal life is a central direction over a society of cells. Vegetable life is an organized republic of cells without a centralized director. A single cell is an organized republic of molecules, and a large-scale inorganic society is just molecules passively accepting spatial necessities. The diverse modes of functioning are produced by diverse modes of organization, but an unbroken continuity bridges everything from the human mind down to the vibrating atom.
Which brings us back to how we perceive this vast continuity, specifically through our eyes. Visual perception is actually a very late evolutionary product. It belongs only to high-grade animals.
And when you analyze it calmly, the information provided by mere sight is peculiarly barren. It merely provides passive facts regions of space, variously colored. There is nothing intrinsic to a patch of red or blue that gives you any hint of the intense, creative internal activity actually occurring beneath the surface. Sight merely registers a passive display.
And so you are left sitting in the quiet, contemplating a deeply provocative thought. If the most highly evolved sense we possess, our vision, only paints a passive, barren picture of colored regions, completely hiding the vibrant, vibrating internal reality of the universe, how can we truly comprehend the profound internal activities where life actually occurs?
That very question forces us to look far beyond passive observation, pushing our inquiry directly into the deeper mechanisms of internal activity, moving us steadily onward to uncover the actual...
When you just sit quietly, and really examine your own existence, it is incredibly easy to take the most fundamental aspects of your reality completely for granted.
It really is.
Today, our mission is to extract the core insights from a truly fascinating book we've been examining.
Great. Alfred Whitehead's Modes of Thought.
Exactly. And we are actually looking at the 10th and final part of this book right now.
The culmination of all these ideas.
Yes, which will all be connected together later to form the complete picture. But specifically, we're looking at the final, culminating concepts of his work right here. This is a profound exploration into how you perceive reality.
How your physical body and your mind are intricately connected.
Almost inseparable, really. And ultimately, it explores the true purpose of philosophic thought itself. It is a book that challenges the most basic assumptions you likely hold about what it means to just exist in the world.
It genuinely does challenge everything. And to really grasp the magnitude of what Whitehead is doing here, we have to settle into a very calm, observant state of mind. We are looking at the essence of what he calls nature alive, and alongside that, the true aim of philosophy. He is essentially asking us to strip away centuries of scientific and philosophical dogma.
Just clear the slate entirely.
Right, to look at the raw, immediate data of our own everyday experience. We have to forget what we've been taught to see and focus on what we actually feel.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because Whitehead starts with a major critique of how society, and particularly traditional science, usually views nature. For a long time, he argues, we have been taught to see nature merely as passive, vacuous bits of matter. Just dead stuff, aimlessly hurrying through space.
To understand where that comes from, think of the 18th and 19th century scientific mindset.
Right.
The epistemology, or, well, the way they understood the limits of human knowledge, was heavily influenced by Newtonian physics and the Industrial Revolution.
It was very mechanical.
Exactly. They viewed the universe like a giant ticking clock made of dead, passive parts. That traditional view is entirely built on a very narrow formulation of sense perception.
Which relies on vision, mostly.
Yes. Specifically picking out visual experience as the ultimate standard of truth. If you can measure it and watch it move, it is real.
But Whitehead points out that this view ignores a tremendously crucial factor.
The constant, inescapable intervention of our own bodies.
So we aren't just objective cameras recording a cold universe.
Far from it. Every single thing you see or hear or feel depends entirely upon the physiological functioning of your body.
Right.
The universe doesn't just hand you a pure, unfiltered image of itself. Your body mediates everything. If you alter the internal functioning of the body, say through fatigue or illness or even just having too much caffeine, you fundamentally alter the visual sensation or the auditory sensation you experience.
The body is always in the way, so to speak.
Always.
It is like looking at a sweeping landscape through a camera lens.
That's a good way to put it.
If that lens is tinted yellow, or if it is warped by a smudge, the entire photograph changes. You aren't just taking a picture of the landscape. You are taking a picture of the landscape as translated by the lens. Our body is that lens. It is supremely indifferent to what is happening a short distance away. It only really cares about where it places its visual sensations internally within its own nervous system.
That analogy holds up well, but we have to take it a step further because the lens isn't just a piece of glass. It is an active biological system.
Right, it's alive.
And this brings us to one of Whitehead's most fascinating concepts, which is the idea of healthy enjoyment.
I love this concept.
We tend to think of emotions as these high-level, purely mental phenomena. We think of joy or sadness or anger as things that happen in the ethereal realm of the mind.
Sort of disconnected from the physical self.
Exactly. But Whitehead argues that our baseline emotional state is actually derived directly from the quiet background functioning of our internal organs. The heart, the lungs, the bowels, the kidneys.
The organs we only ever think about when they stop working properly.
Exactly the point.
Yeah.
We find ourselves in a state of healthy enjoyment of life simply by reason of these organs functioning well. And the profound part of his argument is that this positive emotional state arises precisely because those organs are not providing any direct distressing sensations. The silence of the body is the foundation of our psychological well-being.
You enjoy life simply because you don't have a stomachache.
Exactly.
You enjoy your vision because there is no eye strain, even if you happen to be looking at a terrible painting or an ugly building. The ease of the bodily function itself is the actual source of the positive feeling.
It's completely foundational.
It's wild when you think about it. You could be reading the most depressing news article, but if your body is perfectly rested and digesting well, there is a baseline hum of physical enjoyment happening beneath the psychological stress.
That direct feeling of derivation, the fact that our emotions are at least modified by, if not entirely derived from, the body, is one of our most fundamental experiences. For philosophy, the foundational fact is that the whole complexity of mental experience is anchored in this bodily functioning. It is this basic sense of derivation that leads to our implicit, unquestioned claim of unity.
Like when you say, I am experiencing and my body is mine.
Yes, body and mind are united in this feeling of derivation. There is no sharp dividing line between the physical ache in your shoulder and the feeling of annoyance in your mind.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because Whitehead argues that our immediate experience doesn't just come from the body right now.
No, it doesn't.
It comes from two fused sources. The first is that physical body we just talked about. But the second source is your exact state of mind from a tiny fraction of a second ago.
Yes.
Specifically, Whitehead points to a quarter of a second ago. Why such a specific, tiny measurement?
It is a remarkable observation, and modern neuroscience actually backs up this idea of a processing lag in human perception.
That slight delay.
Think about your present state of mind in this exact moment. You are continuing a previous state. A quarter of a second ago, you were entertaining certain ideas, feeling certain emotions, observing certain facts. Now, the word continuing is tricky here. In one sense, it is too weak a word because you don't just continue. You claim absolute, unbroken identity with that person from a quarter of a second ago.
I don't feel like a descendant of myself.
Exactly. You feel like that was your identical self.
But in another sense, continuing overstates the case because you aren't exactly the same. New elements have intervened in that tiny fraction of time.
The new elements provided by the bodily functionings. So right in this immediate present, you are actively, constantly fusing the new physical data from your body with the basic stuff of experience provided by your state of mind a quarter of a second ago.
And you claim both of these sources as mine.
Yes. The body is mine, the past experience is mine, and there is only one central ego claiming both.
Yet, when we examine this inescapable union of body and soul, neither of them possesses the sharp, rigid boundaries we usually assume they do.
Not at all.
My body feels like a single, solid thing. It feels like a closed system. But under scrutiny, that illusion completely falls apart.
The illusion of strict boundaries is one of our most stubborn blind spots.
Yeah.
Take the human body. We think of it as a clearly defined object with a clear edge, our skin.
Right.
But if you look with microscopic accuracy, there is no definite boundary to determine where the body begins and external nature ends.
Because it's constantly exchanging material.
Exactly. The air you breathe is entering your lungs, becoming part of your blood, while you exhale carbon dioxide that diffuses into the room. The body is a complex unity of happenings, constantly losing billions of molecules and gaining billions of new ones from the environment.
It makes me think of the body as a bustling port city.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
You have cargo ships constantly coming in to drop off supplies, oxygen, food, water, and other ships constantly leaving with exports and waste. The actual physical makeup of the port city is changing every single second. New crates, new ships, new workers, yet it completely retains its identity as that specific city.
It remains itself through the change.
And Whitehead points out that the body can even lose massive parts of itself, like a whole limb in an amputation. And yet you still claim identity with the same body.
Yes, the personal identity remains intact.
Furthermore, the cells in that amputated limb survive in separation from the body for an immense amount of time compared to the vibratory periods of their molecules.
Yeah.
They keep living for a while, even though they're no longer you.
That physical continuity and adaptability is remarkable. But then Whitehead transitions to the soul, or what we might call the stream of consciousness, and reveals it is actually even vaguer than our definition of the physical body.
It's unsettling to think about.
We place so much absolute weight on our personal identity, our soul, yet the continuity of our consciousness constantly has to leap across massive, terrifying gaps in time.
It's wild when you think about it. You go into a deep sleep, and your consciousness basically turns off completely.
A total lapse.
There was a total lapse of the stream of consciousness. And then you wake up and just implicitly trust that you are the exact same person who went to bed.
You don't even question it.
Like, my body is just holding down the fort while my brain is rebooting. We rely entirely on the physical continuity of nature, and specifically our bodies, to bridge those gaps in consciousness. The physical body literally provides the material stuff for the personal endurance of the soul.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this leads us to Whitehead's profound doctrine of mutual immanence.
Mutual immanence.
It sounds like a heavy academic term, but it's actually describing a deeply baffling dual reality you experience every single second.
Okay.
On one hand, the experienced world is the basic fact within your experiences. All your emotions, your purposes, your enjoyments are just your soul's reactions to this world. So in one very real sense, the world is contained within your soul. It is one complex factor in the composition of your mental essence.
To make that tangible song, imagine you are sitting quietly in a room.
Right.
The room is simply an item in your present experience. It exists for you right now as light hitting your retina, the feeling of the chair against your back, the ambient sound. It is a mental construct inside your head. But at the same exact time, your present experience is what you are right now. The world is included within the occasion of your experience.
But the antithetical truth is also undeniably real. You, your soul, are just one tiny temporary component physically contained within the vast external world of that room and the broader universe.
So you contain the room in your mind, but the room physically contains you.
Precisely. You define each other in this exact moment. We have to construe the world in terms of our bodily society, and we must construe our bodily society in terms of the general functionings of the world. Each happening is a factor in the nature of every other happening.
And this completely redefines how we must understand the nature of causation, right?
Absolutely.
Well, because normally when I think of causation, I think of high school physics class. It's like a billiard ball striking another billiard ball. Action and reaction.
So you have to throw the billiard ball analogy completely out the window.
Okay, throwing it out.
Causation is not just the simple physical transfer of a single quality from one detached object to another. If two events could be completely detached and comprehended without reference to one another, the idea of one causing the other becomes entirely unintelligible.
It wouldn't make any sense.
The only sensible doctrine of causation is founded on this mutual immanence we just discussed.
So how does Whitehead actually define it?
He argues that the entire antecedent past, meaning the whole massive history of the world that came before this exact second, conspires to produce a new occasion.
Conspires.
Yes. Causation is the qualitative energies of the past combining into a new pattern of qualitative energies in each present occasion. The past isn't just a static list of things that happen. It is an active force pressing into the present, shaping what happens right now.
If our existence is this constant active process of combining past energies, then where does our conscious thought come in?
That is a crucial question.
Because this brings up a rather famous philosophical concept. In the book, Whitehead actually goes after René Descartes.
He does. He takes aim at arguably the most famous phrase in all of Western philosophy, Descartes' cogito ergo sum.
I think, therefore I am.
Yes.
Wait, why is that flawed? That's treated like the absolute bedrock of logic. You strip everything away, and the only thing you can be sure of is that you are thinking.
Whitehead argues that it is a profound misunderstanding of human consciousness. He points out that we are never actually aware of just bare thought or bare existence.
Never existence.
Mere existence is a sterile abstraction that never enters real human consciousness. Think about your own mind. What you actually find yourself as is a messy, vibrant unity of emotions, enjoyments, hopes, fears, regrets, and decisions.
They're never just empty calculators.
Exactly. These are all subjective reactions to the environment that is active in your nature.
So the I am isn't just a static state of floating in a void thinking math equations. It is the active process of shaping this chaotic welter of material and emotion into a consistent pattern of feelings.
Exactly. If you stress the role of the environment pressing upon you in this process, you call it causation. If you stress the role of your immediate pattern of active enjoyment and how you shape those feelings, you call it self-creation.
That concept of active enjoyment is such a key bridge, which leads right into the distinction Whitehead draws between simply being alive and actually having mentality.
Right.
Because they are not the same thing in his view.
Not at all. We often conflate being alive with having high-level thoughts, but Whitehead separates them beautifully. Life, he says, is the enjoyment of emotion derived from the past and aimed at the future.
It operates as a vector.
Yes. In physics, a vector has direction and magnitude. Life transcends the present moment in two ways. It issues from the past, it is received and enjoyed in the present, and it is thrust forward into the future.
So it has momentum.
It is an activity of concern. Life is deeply engaged in its own immediate self-realization, but it is simultaneously concerned with the surrounding universe. It is the energetic, forward momentum passing from moment to moment.
So, if life is that forward momentum, what is mentality? Because a plant has life, a bacterium has life, but we wouldn't say they have mentality in the way Whitehead means it.
No, we wouldn't.
Mentality is the conceptual experience. It is the entertainment of alternatives and possibilities, completely divorced from sheer physical realization. It's like if life is the engine and the forward momentum of a vehicle, providing the raw energy and the vector, mentality is the GPS system.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. The GPS doesn't power the car.
Right.
It has no engine. But it calculates different possible routes, it entertains the what-ifs, and it gently diverts the direction of the vehicle's raw energy. Whitehead explicitly compares mentality to a catalytic agent in chemistry.
A catalytic agent.
Yes, a catalytic agent modifies a chemical process, speeding it up or changing its outcome without necessarily adding new sources of measurable energy itself.
So mentality operates primarily as a diversion of the flow of energy. It takes the aesthetic process, the way we constitute ourselves out of the streams of feeling received from the past, and it modifies where it's going next.
And we can see different levels of this. In inorganic nature, mentality is merely latent. In the social habits of animals, we see evidence of flashes of mentality in the past that have degenerated into ingrained physical habits.
Instincts, essentially.
Right. But in the higher mammals, and particularly in mankind, we see clear evidence of mentality being habitually effective. We don't just react. We consciously entertain alternatives. We systematize knowledge.
So what does this all mean? When we take all of this, the fusion of our bodies and minds, the continuous creation of the present moment from the energies of the past, the role of mentality diverting that energy, what does this mean for the actual purpose of philosophy and for places of learning like universities?
Whitehead addresses this by identifying a massive intellectual blind spot, which he calls the fallacy of the perfect dictionary.
The fallacy of the perfect dictionary.
This is the incredibly pervasive, mistaken belief that mankind has already consciously entertained all the fundamental ideas applicable to our experience.
Oh, well.
And furthermore, it is the arrogant assumption that our current human language perfectly and explicitly expresses these ideas. Scholars rely on the dictionary. Scholarship often investigates human thought armed with this assumption that the blueprint of the human mind is fixed, finished, and fully documented in our current vocabulary.
It's the arrogance of thinking we have words for absolutely everything.
Exactly.
And anyone who has ever felt a complex wave of grief or a sudden, inexplicable moment of awe looking at the ocean knows that our language is completely inadequate. There are massive parts of the human experience that we simply don't have the dictionary words for.
Language fails us all the time.
So philosophy has to go beyond the dictionary.
It must. Whitehead divides philosophers into two camps based on how they handle this fallacy. You have the critical school, which plays it safe.
Right.
They confine themselves to verbal analysis strictly within the limits of the existing dictionary. They repudiate speculative philosophy because it's messy and unprovable.
They like boundaries.
Yes. And then you have the speculative school, which is entirely built on adventure. They appeal to direct insight. They try to indicate meanings that go far beyond our current words, and in doing so, they actively seek to enlarge the dictionary itself.
It is the eternal quarrel between safety and adventure.
Beautifully said.
The critical school assumes a fixed specification of the human mind. But Whitehead argues that true philosophy is an attitude of mind towards doctrines that are ignorantly entertained.
Yes.
A real philosopher takes every word, every phrase, every obvious truth, and refuses to be satisfied by the conventional presupposition that every sensible person already knows the answer.
As soon as you rest satisfied with primitive ideas, you cease to be a philosopher.
So who is actually doing this speculative philosophy well in Whitehead's eyes? Did he have historical examples of people living out this spirit of adventure?
He did. He looks back at Socrates, who spent his entire life analyzing the current presuppositions of the Athenian world.
A classic example.
Socrates explicitly treated his philosophy as an attitude in the face of ignorance. He was critical, but he was fiercely constructive. And closer to Whitehead's own time, he points right at the Harvard philosophy department from about 30 years prior to his writing.
Who was in that group?
It was a legendary roster. Figures like William James, George Santayana, Josiah Royce, and George Herbert Palmer.
Heavy hitters.
He describes them not just as great individual thinkers, but as a cohesive group of adventure, a group dedicated to the search for new ideas. To be a philosopher, for Whitehead, is to make some humble approach to the characteristic of that group. The task of a university is the creation of the future, so far as rational thought and civilized modes of appreciation can affect the issue.
The use of philosophy is to maintain an active novelty of fundamental ideas to illuminate the social system. It acts to reverse the slow, inevitable descent of accepted thought towards the inactive commonplace. And there is a beautiful, almost mystical connection Whitehead makes at the very end of this exploration. He says philosophy is akin to poetry.
Both of them seek to express that ultimate good sense which we term civilization, but they approach the inexpressible using different tools.
Right.
Poetry uses meter, rhythm, and metaphor to express meaning that goes far beyond the direct, literal definitions of the words. Philosophy uses mathematical pattern and rational coordination to do the exact same thing.
They are reaching for the same truth.
It is an attempt to rationalize mysticism, not by explaining the mystery away or destroying it, but by introducing novel verbal characterizations that are rationally coordinated.
Philosophy begins in wonder. And at the end, when philosophic thought has done its absolute best, the wonder remains.
It never goes away.
But we gain some grasp of the immensity of things and a purification of emotion through that understanding. Existence is an activity ever merging into the future. The ultimate aim of philosophic understanding is to pierce the blindness of that activity.
This raises an important question. If our immediate experiences, as we've discussed, constantly fusing our physical reality with our conceptual state from just a quarter of a second ago, how might we actively use our mentality right in this very second to consciously redirect the flow of energy into our next immediate moment?
It's a profound realization to sit with.
It really is.
Just feeling the energy of the next moment forming right now in the quiet space of this present thought.